The Extraordinary Disappointments of Leopold Berry by Ransom Riggs. Chapter 1. Leopold Berry had been trying to ignore the raccoon in the tree out of the window, but like so many things in life, it seemed impossible. The raccoon was perched on a branch that aligned perfectly with the head of the man Leopold was supposed to be listening to, a man who just asked Leopold a question he hadn't really heard. It almost seemed like the raccoon was trying to distract him on purpose. Twice the creature had nearly fallen out of the tree, only to drag itself back onto the branch after a lot of clawing and flailing. Just now, its tail had burst into flames. The natural thing to do, Leopold realized, would have been to direct the attention of his father and the interviewer to the animal on fire as explanation for why he'd been so distracted these past minutes. He couldn't, of course, because the raccoon's tail was not really on fire. The raccoon was not really there at all. These things happened to Leopold sometimes. When he was 12, a therapist told him he had hyperactive imagination, that he saw strange and impossible things at the moments he most wanted to escape from his life. He'd once been plagued by these dissociative episodes, but it had been years since the last one. Then, a week ago, Leopold had seen a single, small rain cloud trail a harried fruit vendor down a sidewalk in Hollywood. The week before that, through the windshield of his traffic-stalled car, he'd watched a man pry a tooth from his mouth and insert it into a parking meter, prompting a fissure to open in the pavement. With a furtive glance behind him, the man had climbed into the cavity, disappeared just before it closed over his head. But these episodes had been brief, and each time Leopold had assured himself it was nothing to worry about. Who didn't occasionally fantasize while being stuck in traffic? But now the raccoon. This episode had lasted longer than either the tooth man or the fruit vendor, which was disconcerting and at the moment extraordinarily inconvenient. He desperately wished the raccoon was not really there anyway, would just disappear. Then, with a feverish flick of its flaming tail, it did. The meeting had not been going well even prior to the raccoon. Leopold wasn't purposely trying to frustrate his interviewer. An avuncular old man in golf clothes who had started off smiling but now looked like he too wished he was somewhere else. Nor was the hoping to piss off Richter, his tall, barrel-chested father who was growing quietly apoplectic in the chair beside Leopold. He really was doing his best, if only to appear as Richter, but he couldn't focus. The grey suit Leopold had been forced to wear was loose in some places and tight in others. He was certain his pale skin had flushed bright red. He'd forgotten most of the canned responses his father had encouraged him to memorize, and the ones he did remember came out sounding forced. And now he'd allowed 6 seconds of excruciating silence to elapse as he stared at the window at a non-existent raccoon. Leopold directed his eyes back to the man behind the desk. Sorry, what was the question again? There was a creak of stiff leather as Leopold's father dug his fingers into the arms of his chair. Larry's just tired, he said through peroxide white teeth. Poor kid was so excited about this meeting he hardly slept last night. Larry was a nickname Leopold had acquired in childhood and had never been able to shake. Larry Berry. It sounded like a punchline. The only person to ever call him his given name, Leopold, had been his mother, and because it rang foreign on anyone else's tongue, he'd long ago resigned himself to Larry, a name that made him cringe whenever it was spoken aloud. The man glanced at his watch. An electric guitar, signed by the members of some famous band, was displayed proudly on the wall. No need to be nervous, Larry. We're just having a friendly conversation. He grinned in a way that was designed to put Leopold at ease. I ask, what's your greatest strength? What do you feel you're best at? Leopold cleared his throat. He could feel his father's eyes drilling into him. Well, I guess... He tried to conjure one of his answers he'd rehearsed. Something about leadership and problem-solving. I don't really know. If you ask me, Mick, his father cut in, Larry's problem is he has too many strengths. Makes it tough to decide where to focus his energy. Berry family curse. He laughed like a sputtering engine. The man chuckled politely. Then I'll make this easier. How about you give me your top 3? Leopold's mind went blank. He saw something flick among the branches of the tree out the window, but forced himself to ignore it. His palms began to itch. Larry, his father hissed. No need to be modest. I'm not. Leopold shifted in his seat. I'm just not the best at anything. His father made a strangled noise. Oh, I'm sure that's not true, said the interviewer. But it felt true. It was the truest thing Leopold had said aloud in a long time. What he excelled at were minor things his father thought categorically worthless. Working on his old car, tinkering with small electrical objects, and making homemade movies set in the world of a certain fantasy TV show that had long gone off the air before he was born. He was ashamed of those forgettable skills, so he never mentioned them. The man winked. Don't worry, I'm good at finding hidden talents. I certainly hope so, Larry's father muttered. In Richter Berry's opinion, there were two types of people in the world: winners and losers. He'd argued as much in his first book, Think Like a Winner, the publication of which he'd parlayed into a career as a successful coach, a profession that suited him perfectly because it involved mainly yelling at people. So long as he did it with a smile, a shocking number of seemingly well-adjusted people would submit to being berated, harangued, and belittled by Richter Berry in the name of self-improvement. Whole auditoriums of them, all paying for the privilege. Richter was very proud of himself and of his two stepsons, Hal and Drake. Hal, captain of his high school wrestling team, and Drake, going into his second year at USC's business school, were turning out to be killers in the barrel-chested mold of their stepfather. But Richter was worried, had been worried for years, that his biological son, a lean, dreamy, distractible boy with no discernible talent for or interest in anything practical at all, was growing up to become not a winner. But Richter was no quitter. He couldn't abide a failure in the family. It simply didn't fit the brand. He'd given his son several perfectly good options for a future career. Larry could go to law school and become a lawyer, preferably corporate, go to business school and get on the executive track, Fortune 500, or what was the point, do a finance program that would lead to private equity or investment banking, Goldman ideally, though the boy was hopeless with numbers, so that seemed the least likely of the three. All Larry had to do was choose one, and like magic, he'd have the inestimable blessing of his father's support. Richter, self-made son of a pig farmer from a hard-scrabble town in the Midwest, would have killed for such an opportunity at 17. But the boy was like a cat, strange, lazy, and nearly impossible to train. His mother had been far too easy on him, so now, to compensate, Richter had to be hard. Larry had made it abundantly clear that he would never be hard on himself, that if given half the chance, he'd spend the rest of his life with his head in the clouds and accomplish absolutely nothing. So when, after innumerable lectures and tirades, Larry still had not chosen one path over another, Richter had engaged the very expensive services of the best private college administration's counselor in Los Angeles, a man who had miracled C students with no legacy credentials into Harvard, and felonious delinquents from nothing families into Stanford. It was amazing he'd even found the time to slot them in for a meeting. And now, probably just to spite him, his son was flushing a golden opportunity down the toilet. "What about the aptitude test?" Richter asked. The interviewer's bulletproof smile faltered. Wasn't too helpful, I'm afraid. The raccoon was back on its branch, one leg extended skyward, earnestly licking its privates. Larry's results were a bit inconclusive. His grades didn't reveal any special aptitude for one path over another, though that's not especially uncommon. As for the test, Larry scored the perfect average on every metric. He almost looked impressed. Never seen that before. "You mean to say," Leopold's father huffed, "he's perfectly average?" The counselor hesitated. "I think results like this reveal the limitations of testing, not of your son, which is exactly why we bring potential clients in for these little heart-to-hearts." The word potential seemed to hang in the air. "I can help you, Larry, but first you have to be honest with me." "Stop calling me Larry," Leopold thought. The counselor steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Let's forget colleges and careers altogether for a minute. Here's the most important question. What do you love? What's your passion?" Leopold's instinct was to give a canned answer, but there was an attentiveness in the man's eyes that caught him off guard. He actually seemed to be listening. Leopold couldn't remember the last time an adult had done that, and so he was compelled to do something he almost never did in front of his father. Tell something like the truth. "Well, I think I might be good at editing movies," Leopold ventured. He hadn't quite found the courage to say directing movies, and editing sounded like a more achievable but still respectable career prospect. The man leaned forward, head bobbing. "I was wondering maybe about film school." His father wafted a hand through the air. "4-year jerk-off." "Actually, this could be perfect," said the counselor. "This I can work with." Leopold felt a small hope spark in his chest, like maybe his whole life was about to change and a door was opening he'd never known was there. And then the man said, "You should consider entertainment law. Some of the best paid lawyers I know work for movie studios." And as he began to describe the impressive house in Malibu owned by one such lawyer, a ringing filled Leopold's head, and he saw something out the window he could no longer ignore. The raccoon, now fully engulfed in flames and leaping from branch to branch, had caught the tree on fire. As the blaze spread quickly through the canopy, a flock of small birds, also on fire, shuddered out of the leaves and scattered into the air. Leopold went rigid, suppressing a sudden urge to panic. Not because the tree was on fire, he knew it wasn't, but because there was no denying it now. It's happening again, he thought. He was seeing into Sunder. Chapter 2. Drugs? He actually asked me if you were on drugs. That was all Richter Berry said to his son during the long march back to the parking structure, after which he fell into a boiling silence broken only by the sound of his angry breathing, a laboured whistle that issued from his nose as he stared vacantly ahead, trying to calm down enough to start yelling. Richter was silent during the interminable elevator ride down into the parking structure's muggy bowels, silent during the whole Drunken Elephant ballet that was getting out of the congested garage, a procedure made more difficult by the awkward length of Leopold's ancient Volvo station wagon and its lack of parking sensors, backup cameras, or any other modern conveniences. Silence as Leopold struggled to click his frayed seatbelt into place. That Richter hadn't even made a comment about the Volvo, a family embarrassment which he consented to ride in only when his Porsche was in the shop, as it was today, meant he was well and truly about to explode. They reached the pay booth without incident, only to discover that $3.75 was owed, even though Leopold had gotten their parking stub validated, that the garage only accepted cash, and that aside from an old movie ticket stub and his driver's license, Leopold's wallet was empty. He knew better than to ask his father for money, or he'd get the "you've never prepared" lecture on top of whatever tirade was already in store for him. In a panic, he ran his hands through the cup holder, the side door pocket, and the never-used ashtray, which netted him a grand total of $3.50, still a quarter short. As a car honked somewhere in the line forming behind them, Leopold apologized to the old lady attending the booth, unbuckled his safety belt, and jammed his arm down into the crack of the cloth seat. That earned him a cut on a finger, a smear of belt actuator lubricant on his wrist, and 2 sticky dimes. He gathered the coins and wadded bills and held them out in cupped hands. Accepting them with a lugubrious sigh, the attendant began to tally the change. She was of young grandma age, just elderly enough that Leopold wondered what had gone wrong in her life that she had to work a job like this, forced to make change all day in the lightless belly of Beverly Hills office building. She wore a rumpled green vest with the words Underground Parking Corp stitched above a name badge that read Rochelle. Another horn bellowed in the rumbling gloom. Sweat trickled down Leopold's collar. Rochelle finished her leisurely count and looked up at him, expressionless. "You owe me a nickel." "I know, I'm really sorry, that's all I have." Leopold prayed she would just shrug and wave him through, but she only stared. Leopold tried again. "Could I come back with it later?" Richter sighed, leaned roughly across Leopold, and thrust a $100 bill at the woman. This meant the "you've never prepared" lecture was now unavoidable. The attendant pursed her lips and pointed to a sign that read "No bills over $20." Richter Berry retracted his hand with imperial slowness before folding the money carefully into his crocodile leather wallet. He preferred cash and never carried anything smaller than $100, on principle. A principle covered in the Chapter 4 of Think Like a Winner. "You have 5 days to pay via mail," the attendant monotoned, "or your debt will be turned over to a collections agency. I'll give you the address." Even in the dark, Leopold could sense his father turning purple. The attendant swiveled on her stool to grab a slip of paper, and that was when it came to Leopold's attention that she had a pair of wings sprouting through the back of her vest. They were dull grey, about the size of a backpack, and lay folded against her shoulder blades, the feathers a bit rumpled from long hours of sitting. Leopold sat blinking, his face going tingly. He seemed to lose a bit of time. One moment, he was staring at the wings and wondering how she'd gotten her clothes over them, and the next, he was jolted by another car horn, the attendant having swiveled back to face him. She gave him a strange look while waving the slip of paper in his direction. He reached out to take it, his eyes fixed on her vest. He was sure the words stitched above her name badge changed. With the addition of a single letter, they now read, Sunderground Parking Corp. He whispered the word aloud, his lips forming it involuntary. Sunder. The woman snatched his outstretched wrist. Her hand was icy, and the strength in her arthritic fingers was unbelievable, like talons digging into his skin. She leaned toward him and whispered in a voice that was low and raspy and slightly threatening. "It ain't polite to stare." The ghost of a smile touched her lips, then vanished just as quickly. She let him go. He reeled back into his seat. The barrier arms swung upward, and another car blasted its horn. "Drive!" Richter snapped, looking up from something he'd been typing on his phone. "What's wrong with you?" Leopold eased the car forward, watching the woman's reflection shrink in the mirror until sunlight blasted through the windshield, erasing her. As Richter wondered aloud whether his son might really be on drugs, Leopold waited for a break in the traffic, gripping the wheel tightly so his father wouldn't see his hands shaking. Chapter 3. Mercifully, Richter hadn't seemed to notice Leopold's bizarre interaction with the parking garage attendant, nor had he seen the wings, because, of course, they hadn't been there. Leopold knew from experience that his episodes tended to cluster in threes. The raccoon had been the first, what happened in the garage the second. Given what usually triggered them, and how badly he wanted to be anywhere other than the trapped in the car with his father in steadily thickening traffic, it seemed reasonable to expect that a third would be along any time now. He couldn't let it happen. Not while he was behind the wheel of a moving car, especially with Richter riding shotgun. Telling his dad what was happening to him was not an option, so Leopold focused on the road ahead and pretended Richter wasn't there, nodding occasionally to simulate listening. Maybe this way he would make it home without seeing any more flaming Gulf fauna or parking garage angels. And maybe this way he wouldn't blank out for 30 seconds and crash the car. Damn it, Larry, I said take Fountain. Richter's sudden bellow pulled Leopold from his reverie and back into La Cienega Boulevard's rightmost lane, where he just missed a crucial turn. This sparked the always take Fountain speech, which he endured with little nods and apologies. He'd learned early in life there was no arguing with his dad. That would only prolong the lecture and raise its emotional temperature a few notches of the Richter scale. You just had to endure, and eventually he'd wear himself out. The lectures could be cool-tempered speeches or angry tirades, but they always fell into one of few categories. So predictable, Leopold had given them names. After they left the garage and became enmeshed in traffic, Richter had launched into an impassioned delivery of, I've never been so embarrassed in my life, an old favourite. He then veered into, you've got no ambition, downshifted into, aren't you ashamed of yourself, and pirouetted with virtuistic flair into a weirdly self-pitying version of, it's my fault for spoiling you, all interspersed with highlights from Larry's A Shitty Driver, a classic Leopold could have recited from memory. At a red light, he felt the Volvo stutter and threatened to stall. He shifted into neutral and feathered the gas so it wouldn't die in the middle of the road, which would almost certainly trigger a high-volume rendition of, I should sell this shit heap for scrap, which, of all his father's lectures, was the one Leopold hated most. The Volvo, Bessie, was Leopold's dearest possession. She was egg yolk yellow and speckled with rust, and it belonged to his mother. Richter regularly threatened to get rid of it because it was unreliable and ugly and didn't fit the Berry brand. That he never followed through in his threats seemed a rare proof of kindness in his father, as well as a quiet admission that he too missed Leopold's mum, though they never really spoke about it. It was also, Leopold assumed, the only reason Richter allowed the Volvo to remain in their driveway. Leopold glanced at the trip odometer. 7,261 miles. It hadn't been zeroed since she died. Leopold couldn't bring himself to hit the button, because he marked her death with miles rather than years. 5.5 years ago sounded infinite, an unbridgeable vastness. Somehow, 7,261 miles ago felt closer. That was just a long plane trip. Sometimes Leopold rode his bike or took the bus because he couldn't bear to watch the number creep any higher. Sometimes, when he could no longer stand being in his father's house but had nowhere else to go, he'd slip out and sit in the car for hours, just reading or listening to music. When things got really unbearable, he'd sneak out at night and sleep in the back seat. Green light. He shifted into first and the Volvo jerked into motion. At some point, the lecture had morphed into a recounting of Leopold's recent failures. Richter totting them up on his fingers. Cut from the baseball team, rejected from that internship. Only summer job you could find was in some lousy coffee shop. And now this. The steady drumbeat of loser, loser, loser threatened to suffocate him. He willed himself to think of nothing. Instead, watching the odometer tick over another mile, Leopold thought of his mother, and then of Sunder. One often begat the other. Chapter 4. Shortly after his 20th birthday, in the unseasonable heat of a Los Angeles December, Leopold's mother had died. It was cancer, rare and aggressive. Oh, 12th, not 20th. I can't read. It was cancer, rare and aggressive and swift. Before it took her, Monica Berry had insisted on celebrating her son's birthday despite the circumstances, and in the grim period following her death, he was haunted by the image of a forgotten balloon slowly deflating in the corner of her hospital room. That summer, in the gloom of a sunless June, the episodes had begun. He came to think of them as seeing into Sunder. Sunder was a fictional realm from a 1990s fantasy TV series called Max's Adventures in Sunderworld, which had aired and gone off the air over a decade before Leopold was born. It was in the blurry weeks after his mother's burial, amidst the hectic move from their bungalow in Venice to Richter's house in Brentwood, that he'd found the 7 VHS tapes of its one and only season in a cardboard box bound for the trash. He'd never seen the tapes before and had never heard of the show. He assumed it was one of the many projects his mother had worked on during her useful stint as a film and TV assistant. He rescued the tapes and a battered old VCR. It was a few weeks before he bothered figuring out how to hook the VCR up to the TV. And another few before, late at night in his cold new room in Richter's house, he got around to popping in the first tape. He engaged with only mild interest at first, because Sunderworld was kind of campy and cheap-looking. Wooden acting, flimsy sets, cinematography that sometimes wasn't even in focus. It followed the adventures of a seemingly unremarkable boy named Max who meets a talking, half-mechanical coyote in the desiccated field behind his apartment complex. The coyote, harried and short on details, gives Max an ornate key before vanishing in a puff of flame. Max locates the corresponding door beneath a freeway overpass, discovers the pleasantly cliché-ridden magical society hidden in the nooks and crannies of Los Angeles, then further discovers he's not only a spark, as the magically inclined citizens of Sunder are known, but a once-in-a-generation channeler, gifted with great power and tasked with protecting Sunder against Noxum, monstrous invaders from the Ninth Realm. Max learns to wield an aether focus and spends the rest of the season kicking Noxum's ass up and down the streets of Sunder in ways that were highly creative and surprisingly gory for what was ostensibly a kids' show. Leopold was aware of Sunderworld's surface-level crappiness, even at the age of 12, and yet there was something about the show and its weird alley fantasy world that captured his heart. It wasn't long before he was properly obsessed. He watched Sunderworld so many times his ancient VCR started eating the tapes, unwinding them into tangled black nests that could be extracted from the machine only with chopsticks and surgical precision. Having committed every episode to memory and hungry for more of what was clearly an unfinished story, Leopold set out to make new episodes himself. He wrote scripts longhand on legal pads, assembled costumes and props from thrift store junk, and recruited neighborhood kids as actors. He cast his best friend, Emmett Worthington, as Max, and in rec rooms and backyards across LA, they span out the continuing adventures of Max and his magical companions. They spent weekends shooting and long nights creating mangle-faced monsters that sprouted fountains of corn syrup blood. They never finished a single episode, but it didn't matter. Through the bleakest time he had ever known, Leopold was happy only when immersed in Sunder. "Forget Fountain," his father said with a rough sigh. "Take Sunset instead. I need to check on the new billboard." Leopold, who'd been trying to circle back to Fountain via a series of painful left-hand turns, felt a loosening in his chest as he signaled and made a comparatively easy right. The emotional temperature in the car began to drop. His father's publisher had taken out an actual physical, in-person ad to promote his latest book, Only Losers Don't Win, and the prospect of seeing his own face 50 feet wide and glowering across Sunset Boulevard seemed to improve Richter's mood almost instantly. Leopold merged carefully into the 6-lane circus that was Sunset at rush hour. Now all he had to do was pilot them home without seeing into Sunder again. The first time it happened, over that long-ago summer following his mother's death, Leopold had been scouting locations for a shoot near the tar pits. It was down an alley between Gardner and Detroit, ringed by overflowing dumpsters, that he'd seen a pair of rust fiends feasting on a pile of old computers. They'd looked up, keyboards impaled in their blunt tusks, and spat a volley of steaming green bile in Leopold's direction. Terrified, he'd fled straight home. Leopold assumed it had been some kind of waking dream. Then, a week later, it happened again. He'd been in Hollywood with Emmett and a couple of other friends, waiting on the sidewalk for Emmett's mum to pick them up after a matinee at the El Capitan. The Paladin woman was unmistakable in her long leather coat and boots, a heavy glass ether focuser dangling from a holster on her belt. She could have been another Hollywood impersonator trolling for tips, except that Sunderworld was completely unknown outside a small circle of friends, and because her head had been engulfed by a bright blue glow. No one else had even noticed her. By the time Leopold had collected his wits and followed her into the laundromat next door, she was gone. But this time, he wasn't terrified. Leopold was elated. In the show, Max had seen things that didn't seem to align with reality. They were pre-Coyote's peeks into Sunder before he got his key, designed to prepare Max's mind for what would otherwise be an unalloyed trauma. Naturally, Leopold came to believe his episodes were preparing him for his own adventures, and that soon he'd be meeting a half-mechanical harbinger of his own, getting his own key, finding his own door. He'd felt more certain of this than about anything since his mother died. Still, Leopold told no one, not even Emmett. He marked the date in his calendar. Keys were usually granted at the summer solstice. But when the summer solstice of his 12th year came and went without a visit from a key-bearing coyote, Leopold was crestfallen. With the rug pulled, the enormity of his mother's death threatened to crush him. His father, rather than help Leopold mourn the woman for whom he'd been acrimoniously divorced, shuffled Leopold off to a series of grief counselors. The boy sank into a dark place and drifted away from most of his friends. When another year came and went without a key, Leopold began to wonder if it was because he'd moved away from the house where he'd lived for so long with his mum, and some Sundarian functionary he had simply failed to inform the coyote of Leopold's forwarding address. So he spent the solstice day of his 14th year camped out on the sidewalk in front of their old house in Venice, where strangers now lived. No key was delivered. He'd gotten badly sunburnt from sitting outside for hours, but no coyote came. And so at 14, he'd finally stopped hoping, stopped believing, stopped seeing sparks and magical creatures. With the help of a therapist, Leopold realized he'd been seeing those things only because he needed the fantasy to move through the darkest depths of his grief. In that way, Sunder had saved him, even though it was just a crappy old TV show. He was grateful for that, at least. He'd thrown away his props and buried the tapes in a closet. These days, Sunder rarely crossed his mind. Unloved and obscure, Sunderworld had never been released on DVD or Blu-ray. No one had even bothered uploading it to YouTube. It had been 3 years since he'd seen so much of a snippet of it. 3 years since he'd seen into Sunder, too, though he didn't think of his episodes that way anymore. Now there'd been 2 in a day, and then Richter exploded, and there was another. Chapter 5. It was the billboard that set him off. Perched on the hill above Carney's, on the north side of the street across from Sunset Tower Hotel, it loomed into view and sent Richter into an instant rage. The printers had misspelled the name of his website. Leopold's adrenaline spiked as his father ranted about suing the printer, demanding that his son look at the incompetence he was forced to deal with. Leopold glanced at the billboard for only a moment, and then returned his eyes to the road to discover a red blur filling the better part of the windshield. Some kind of streetcar was crossing in front of them, careening through the intersection, and they were about to slam straight into it. Leopold shouted and hit the brakes. Their seatbelts locked as a tide of trash from the back seat broke over them, the Volvo fishtailing while cars swerved and honked. The unhinged screaming began even before they'd come to a full stop. Are you trying to kill us? What the hell is wrong with you? We were going to hit that red trolley thing. What trolley? What are you talking about? Are you out of your goddamn mind? Leopold looked again. There was no streetcar climbing the hill to their left. No trolley tracks in the pavement. I should take away your license. Richter plucked a crumpled hamburger wrapper from his lap and flung it at his son. This shit heap is getting scrapped first thing tomorrow, and this time I mean it. His father got out, slammed the door, and flipped off his own giant face. Then he started speed walking down Sunset, leaving Leopold to sort out the mess on his own. Leopold's hands were shaking and itching. He tried to start the Volvo. It had stalled, of course, and now refused to start again. He screamed in pure blind rage, and slammed his hands against the wheel as hard as he could. And a Roman candle's worth of bright red sparks came flaring out of them, blinding him briefly while filling the car with amber-hued smoke. It was several seconds before it dissipated, leaving ghostly walls of whitish vapor curling in the air. Leopold sat there, stunned, as the last traces evaporated. He couldn't hear the horns anymore, or Sunset Boulevard at all, only the blood pounding in his ears. He turned his hands over and stared at them. They throbbed a little, but aside from the old, faintly ridged line of moon-shaped calluses that cut across the center of both palms, his hand looked normal. Only they didn't itch anymore. Chapter 6. The city's din filtered back into his ears. Honks, brakes, shouting. He was blocking 2 lanes of Sunset Boulevard at rush hour. He tried to forget what had happened with his hands. Reality was more pressing now. If he didn't get his car moving soon, it was only a matter of time before he got towed, rear-ended, or shot. He turned the key, though he knew it was useless. The engine only sputtered. Leopold sighed and banged his head against the steering wheel, a familiar sensation of failure enveloping him. When he raised his head again, the first thing he saw was his father's giant face looming against the sky, radiating disappointment. And then he read the line below the new book's title and about how the last one had been an instant bestseller, and he pictured the corner of their garage that was filled almost to the ceiling with unopened boxes of the books his father had brought himself, and something inside Leopold turned to hot metal. He yanked the hood release, threw open his door, and got out the car without waiting for a break in the traffic. Ignoring the honks from passing motorists, he circled the Volvo, opening the hood, and tugged apart a bundle of wires beside the inlet manifold. The oxygen sensor cable had rattled loose from its harness again. He reseated the wire and wrapped it with fresh electrical tape from the roll he kept on hand for such occasions. A new sensor was expensive, one of several chronic maintenance issues that would have cost more to fix than the Volvo was worth. This summer, he'd already poured most of what he'd earned slinging lattes at his coffee shop job into keeping her running. His dad was certainly not interested in throwing money at a car that left oil stains on his pristine driveway. Richter had even tried to bribe him with a less elderly and mechanically superior BMW if Leopold would only let the Volvo go. But Leopold had refused, and Richter, assuming the cost and trouble of fixing the Volvo would eventually break his son's will, had let the matter drop. Instead, Leopold had learned how to deal with all but the most complex of the car's issues himself. In the past year, had become an expert in the seemingly endless mechanical quirks of 1991 Volvo 240 station wagons. This was surprising to Richter only because he didn't pay much attention to his son. Leopold had always been stubborn and proud, and he liked doing fussy technical work with his hands. It had started with learning to repair a janky old VCR back when he was watching Sunderworld 10 hours a day. Lately, he'd been coaxing the coffee shop's temperamental 50-year-old espresso machine back to life whenever it broke. Leopold found the close attention such tasks demanded of him centering. They distracted him from the mental quicksand of anxiety and self-doubt. At the moment, reseating the detached oxygen sensor cable was distracting him from the question of whether he might be losing his mind. As vehicles whipped dangerously around him on both sides, he wondered if he'd crossed the line from stubbornness to stupidity. He was now risking his life for an old car. Maybe it really was time to let her go. He just finished wrapping the new connection when a great boom sounded, rattling the ground and startling Leopold so badly he cracked his head on the underside of the hood. He emerged, rubbing the back of his skull to find the sky, which a minute ago had been its usual smog-stained tan, was now crowded with thunderclouds. All at once it began pouring rain. He closed the hood and dove back into the car, though not quickly enough to avoid getting soaked. He sat for a moment, gazing at his still-throbbing hands, then out at the rain. A small, quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Did I do that?" He chased away the thought, then turned the key in the ignition. The Volvo started. Rain transformed the windshield into a weeping smear of refracted neon. He turned on the wipers, but only the one was on the passenger side worked. The other had been wrenched off by a vandal back in March, the last time it had rained in LA, and he hadn't yet bothered to replace it. He leaned his body all the way across the center console so that he could see through the windshield's unsmeared half and drove with one stretched leg and one pointed toe working the pedals. He joined the halting flow of early evening traffic. After a few blocks, it occurred to him that he had no intention of going home. He didn't want to face his father, couldn't stomach another lecture, and wasn't about to deliver Bessie back to a place where a tow truck might be waiting to haul her away. If anyone was getting rid of the Volvo, it would be Leopold himself, on his own terms and in his own time. So for a few minutes he just drove, the touristy glitz of sunset giving way to the gritty strip malls of Hollywood, and he tried to make sense of what was happening to him. It all seemed obvious enough in retrospect. The flaming raccoon, the winged woman, the red streetcar. Episodes all in his head. And the red sparks. Could his mind really have manufactured such an insanely real-seeming thing just inches from his eyes? He folded the fingers of his right hand inward to trace the scarred ridge along his palm. It was a self-inflicted wound from years ago, when he used to clench his fists so hard the fingernails bit indelibly on indelible half-moons into his flesh. The itching and heat could be some new phase of the healing process, he supposed. He'd read that certain scars could take a decade to mend. But the rain, he hadn't imagined that. The city was in the grip of a months-long drought, so dire that wildfires had been erupting in the foothills. No rain had been forecast. Even a drizzle would have been news. Suddenly, he couldn't seem to get enough air into his lungs. Of course he didn't make it rain. Just entertaining the idea made him feel like he was losing his grip on reality. It had been a coincidence, obviously, and making anything more of it was dangerous. If he let himself believe he could control the weather, who knew what he'd let himself believe tomorrow? And then he'd be off the deep end completely, back to the days he'd spent waiting for talking coyotes to deliver magical keys. No, it was all in his mind. Old, undigested traumas being regurgitated. He just prayed the episodes would stop. It was one thing for a fragile 12-year-old who'd lost a parent to have psychotic breaks. Call it what it was. And quite another for an almost 18-year-old who was supposed to be applying to a top-tier college to endure them. The rain worsened, grinding traffic to a crawl. It was hard to see even through the wipered section of the windshield. Bessie inched along a block of sagging courtyard motels, their signs boasting amenities like electric heat. At a standstill, he collected the fast food wrappers and parking receipts that had cascaded forward during the near crash, tossing them into a Ralph's bag. He was nearly finished when beneath it all he uncovered something that gave him pause. A flimsy book, one that had been wedged tight under the passenger seat. It was his mother's old Thomas guide, a spiral-bound street atlas of Los Angeles with a bleached photo of downtown's stubby skyline on its cover. Though Leopold hadn't looked at it in years, he'd never forgotten it was there. The guide was long out of date. It had been ancient even 7,261 miles ago, but his mother had refused to drive anywhere without it. Just in case, she always said, although she'd never said in case of what. One day, after he'd finally gotten his license, he'd cracked it open and found a note inside the front cover, inscribed to him in his mother's handwriting. To Leopold, just in case. He shoved it back under the seat like it was radioactive, and there it had stayed. Now he shoved it back again. A truck horn blared, and Leopold's head snapped up as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have. He stomped a pedal and Bessie lurched forward, his heart racing inexplicably. And then, spotting a rain-bleared figure through the passenger window, Leopold's mind produced a word he hadn't thought of in years. Shiggoth. Leopold relaxed. A shiggoth was a lizard-like monster from Sunderworld. This was just a woman shielding herself from the rain with a fold of sopping cardboard, her stringy hair like a wet mop. She ran toward one of the glary neon motels, taking shelter under a ragged awning. Fade Inn was the grungiest on the block, with barred windows and a faulty sign that blinked irregularly. The woman seemed to be staring at Leopold, her head turning as the Volvo passed at a walking pace. Then she opened her mouth and a long, narrow tongue shot out, snatched something from the air, and reeled back again. Leopold thought, nope. That would be his mantra. Nope, not today. The woman took a moment to savor whatever it was she'd caught before tossing away her cardboard umbrella and scurrying inside the motel. Nope, not happening. Leopold repeated to himself, and then traffic unclenched its grip, and he began to move forward. Now his heart was pounding. He was starting to get scared, not of the visions, but of his own unraveling. He swore and swore, a long, angry litany of foulness directed at himself and his traitorous brain. He knew he should have parked the car and called an Uber, but he was too stubborn to pay $20 to get somewhere he could have driven blindfolded. In fact, his hands had already made the right turn onto Las Palmas, because they seemed to have figured out what he needed before even his brain had. He needed to talk to Emmett. Emmett Worthington, Leopold's best friend since 4th grade, was the only person in the world with whom Leopold could imagine having a conversation about whether he might be losing his sanity. Just as this occurred to him, his phone started vibrating. With some effort, he wedged it out of his pants pocket. Mind meld. It was Emmett. You almost here? Emmett said, half shouting over the noise in the background. I don't see you. Almost where? Leopold asked. But then he remembered, and his stomach sank. The stench. Mika's show. He was annoyed. The band plays in half an hour. Mika was Emmett's girlfriend, and Emmett was nothing if not a dutiful partner. In all the craziness of the past few hours, Leopold had completely forgotten that he'd promised to be there, which meant it was going to be very hard to talk to Emmett alone. Shit, I totally spaced. I'm sorry. It's been a day. But you're coming? Yeah, yes. And hey, at some point tonight, I need to talk to you. What happened? Your dad's head finally explode? Something like that. There was a slight pause. You okay, Mr. Berry? They'd addressed each other with a formal mister since age 9. A joke that stuck. I'm fine, Mr. Worthington. See you in 20. Take Fountain, traffic shit. Always, replied Leopold. Chapter 7. Leopold sat parked across from the stench, the rain slackening to mist, his heart slowing as Bessie's hot engine ticked. A painterly twilight had settled over the city, magical and portentous, lending this soot-stained slice of downtown an otherworldly splendor. The dead-eyed windows of old warehouses lining the street had come briefly alive, reflecting the bruised violet of the sky, and the razor wire that snaked everywhere across the roofs glinted like tinsel. Even the grim little dive bar at the end of the block looked halfway inviting now, draped in the kind of light of dusk. There had been no more episodes since the woman outside the motel. Leopold's mind was beginning to settle, his chest to unclench. Still, he needed to calm down a bit more before he could face the stench and its regulars. A few teenagers smoked outside an iron-barred door. The stench had no proper sign, just a graffiti wall where the name was sometimes painted and sometimes not. It was an old punk club that had gone belly up in the early 2000s and had been reclaimed by straight-edge vegans, who turned it into an art and music space that only served juice and a funky mushroom-tasting coffee, so people as young as 15 could get in. It had been adopted as a hangout spot choice by seemingly half the weird kids in the city, who'd all started unlistenable noise bands that performed here, and by a smaller population of nerds who dominated the upstairs loft space with tabletop role-playing games. The two groups tolerated each other but rarely mixed, though detachments of nerds could occasionally wander downstairs, eyes glazed from long dragon battles, to watch a noise band with bemused curiosity. Leopold didn't care much for noise bands, or role-playing games, or mushroomy coffee, but he did care for Emmett, who loved it all, so he ended up spending a lot of time at the stench. Regarding himself in the rearview mirror, Leopold found the sight so comically discouraging he almost laughed. His suit jacket was soggy, his neck ringed with red marks from his tight collar. He unbuttoned it and tossed his tie into the footwell. Wet, rust-brown hair hung limply over his hazel eyes. He raked the strands aside with his fingers, inadvertently drawing a third eyebrow of engine grease across his pale forehead. As a boy, his mum had often held his face in her hands, promising he'd grow up to be a handsome young man. But she hadn't lived long enough to judge the results. At that moment, in Leopold's humble opinion, he resembled a traveling salesman who'd slept at a bus station. With a resigned sigh, he reached behind a seat and dragged out the club, a heavy steel bar with a U-hook at each end. Not that anyone would want to steal Bessie. Still, he couldn't bear the thought of her being joy-ridden or dismembered for parts, so he wedged the club's hooks through the steering wheel and locked it, then got out and ran across the street. Maybe if he hurried, he could still catch Emmett before Mika's set began. The smoking kids ignored him, so did the bouncer engrossed in his phone. Leopold hurried down a dim hallway papered in peeling posters, following an amplified whine that might have been Mika's band tuning their instruments, or might have been a song. He emerged into the main room to discover Mika posing with her bandmates under the spotlights of the little stage. A few dozen art kids congregated in cliquey knots. A respectable turnout. If the audience outnumbered the band on a random weeknight, the gig could be considered a success. Leopold threaded the crowd and found Emmett at the front. They'd met on the first day of 4th grade when Emmett, one of the few black kids in his class, had shown up wearing the Evil Dead t-shirt, 3 sizes too big for him. Recognizing a kindred spirit, Leopold had walked right up to him and shaken his hand like a bona fide adult, and Emmett had been calling him Mr. Berry ever since. "You okay?" Emmett said by way of hello, shouting over the noise. "Yeah," Leopold shouted back, which at the moment was honest enough. Just being in his friend's presence was making him feel better than he had all day. Emmett nodded good, held up a finger, talking a minute, then turned his attention back to the broken typewriters, who were, as it happens, in the middle of a song. Leopold did his best to feign interest. All 4 members wore white painter's jumpsuits. A girl in giant lensless grandma glasses was playing a saw with a violin bow, bending it to produce a noise that sounded uncannily like weeping. A hollow-cheeked goth boy tore pages from a phone book while kicking a drawer full of silverware in a 4/4 rhythm. Mika herself, who Leopold supposed was the singer, held a microphone up to an old tape deck that played a warbly recording of Mika's 8-year-old sister singing Earth Died Screaming by Tom Waits. The band was originally conceived as a Waits cover act, but had diverged at some point during the first rehearsal. Talent-wise, the typewriters were on par with most bands that played at the Stench, all of which were locked in self-defeating war to outweird one another. Legend had it, the crowd once gathered to watch a janitor vacuum the stage and applauded when he'd finished, to which the janitor had reacted with confusion, then disgust. Mika's band abruptly stopped. After an uncertain quiet, there came a smattering of applause from the crowd, then wild cheering from Emmett and an older Japanese couple. Mika announced that they were taking a break. She jumped down from the stage, gave Emmett a deep kiss, said hi to Leopold, and slouched off to talk to her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Yamamoto, also in the front row, were broken typewriter superfans. Emmett turned to face him. So? There were people everywhere. Roof, Leopold said, and they headed to the stairs. Nerds crowded the second-floor landing, a gangly blue-haired one button holding Emmett as they tried to pass. You playing tonight? Jeremiah's got a killer campaign plotted out. Through an open doorway, Leopold counted 10 or 12 people in cosplay regalia, pulling up chairs up a long table covered with papers and figurines. Emmett demurred. Rain check. Emmett was the rare social chameleon who was popular with the athletes, the art kids, and the nerds, and who paid no social price for his association with any of them. Leopold, who seemed to fit nowhere in particular, had always floated at the margins. Larry, what about you? Blue Hair was throwing him a bone. Leopold tossed it back. Not tonight. Your loss. Leopold followed Emmett up another set of stairs, through a metal fire door onto the hallowed rectangle of open space that was the roof. Tar paper shingles underfoot, a loose confederacy of wet lawn chairs, sagging Christmas lights strung across a chest-high barrier. For the moment, they had it to themselves. They stepped around a puddle of drowned band flyers, leaned against the barrier, and looked out at the skyline, such as it was. Pockets of dark interspersed with neon. Downtown's distant high-rises shrouded in mist, and whirling lights of an ambulance tracking through the maze at right angles like Pac-Man pursued by ghosts. Evan had worn a white painter's jumpsuit in solidarity with the band, and standing there surveying the city, he looked like a superhero awaiting his call to action. His height and athletic build helped the effect. Emmett Worthington was many things Leopold was not. Level-headed, socially adept, well-liked. He was a shoo-in for either Stanford or Caltech, where his parents were professors. He was also loyal, and even as he graduated from outcast adjacent to something like cool in the 9th grade, he'd never made Leopold feel extraneous. Emmett wasn't Leopold's only friend, but he was in many ways the only one who mattered. Have you ever heard of it raining like this in August? Emmett said. I bet there's actual water in the LA River right now, not just dead bodies and old shopping carts. So weird, Leopold agreed, his anxiety rising at the mention of rain, which he'd had nothing to do with. Emmett took out a vape pen and held it to his lips. It glowed brightly. A moment later, he blew out a cloud of apricot-flavored smoke toward the high-rises. Leopold shot him a look. Seriously, I thought you quit. I did. Then I unquit. Well, re-quit, that's disgusting. Emmett sighed. Tomorrow. Don't tell Mika, okay? I won't tell Mika, I'll tell your mom. Wow, Emmett raised an eyebrow and took another drag. I think it's been too long since the last time I kicked your ass. Leopold cracked a smile. I'm serious, it's not cool to smoke anymore. It's celery juice or die. Emmett poked him in the chest. Beep. Next track. I'm concerned, you can't just next track me. I'm the one who should be concerned. You sounded freaked out on the phone. And that suit. Emmett winced as he appraised Leopold. It was Richter's idea for the interview. Right, that was today, said Emmett, nodding. I'm guessing it didn't go well. It couldn't have gone worse if Leopold had ripped down his pants and evacuated his bowels on the floor, but there was no need to belabor the point, so he just said no. Did you finally pick a career from Herr Richter's Wheel of Futures? Not yet, said Leopold. I may have mentioned film school. Jesus, take the wheel. Emmett exhaled another curl of vapor. So Richter finally lost it. What happened? Leopold only shook his head. What, he kick you out? Slash Bessie's tires? Emmett raised his eyebrows. Threaten you with community college? When Leopold didn't laugh, Emmett looked genuinely concerned. All right, talk. You're starting to scare me. For an hour he'd been dying to tell Emmett about the episodes, but now he found himself hesitating. What did he want from his friend? Reassurance he wasn't going crazy? He didn't know if Emmett could give him that. He only knew he needed to tell someone he trusted what had happened. Feeling like he was about to dive into a pool of icy water, Leopold said quietly, I started seeing things again. Emmett took a beat, his expression carefully neutral. Like what? Sunder things. Emmett turned his head and blew out another jet of smoke. Haven't heard that word in a while. When did it start? A few weeks ago. Just a little at first. Then, today a lot. What's a lot? 3 or 4 times? Emmett swore softly. Leopold haphazardly glanced at him, but in his friend's narrowed eyes he only saw concern. So Leopold laid out the whole strange story, beginning weeks ago with the fruit vendor chased by a rain cloud and ending with the lizard-tongued woman outside the motel. He found himself downplaying the terror of some moments, like when he thought they were about to collide with a streetcar, because he didn't want to worry Emmett more than was necessary. But he left nothing out. And then you drove straight here? Yeah, Leopold said. The whine of a musical saw echoed faintly through the propped fire door. Mika's band had started again, but Emmett made no move to go inside. Why'd you wait so long to tell me? Didn't think it was a big deal. Emmett's eyes flashed. Your first episode in years and you didn't think it was a big deal? Come on, Larry. I figured it was a one-time thing. You mean you hoped it was? And I guess I was embarrassed. That was only half the truth. The other half was that he'd been afraid it would push Emmett away, as it had when they were younger. When Leopold's episode had persisted even after his first major no-key, no-coyote disappointment, he'd finally confessed to Emmett that he was seeing rust friends and fiends in alleys and so on. And Emmett had gone along, assuming it was all part of some elaborate game. Eventually, Emmett made the mistake of mentioning Sunder in front of his parents, and something in the way he talked about with nearly as much conviction as Leopold spooked them so much they told Emmett he couldn't hang out with Leopold for a while, and to make certain of it, they packed Emmett off to summer camp. When Emmett finally returned, Leopold pretended he'd never believed Sunder was real in the first place, and slowly their friendship revived. It wasn't until they were 16, long after Leopold really had stopped believing Sunder was real, that he was brave enough to admit how long the episodes had persisted. You should be embarrassed, Emmett said dryly. You both know a Shiggoth will shrivel up if it's out of water for more than 20 minutes, so unless she was living in that motel's pool, those are some really low-rent hallucinations. If you're going to bug out, can you at least do it in a way that respects canon? It was raining, Leopold said, flipping him off. All right, listen. Emmett's grin vanished. You've been going through some shit with your dad and it's been triggering you. Seeing Sunder is one of the ways your brain deals with that, right? Right. Leopold pushed a hand through his damp hair. I hate my brain. No, we're not doing that. Emmett pointed at him with the vape pen. I know your brain and it's a perfectly good one. But when things like this happen, you have to talk about it or they only get worse. So next time tell me. Right away. Middle of the night, whatever. Okay? Okay, Leopold said, exhaling. He felt a sudden rush of gratitude for Emmett and resisted the urge to give him a giant, backslapping hug. He was trying to affect the air of someone who wasn't on the verge of a breakdown, and it was hard work keeping up the show. Thanks, man. Anytime. Emmett watched him carefully. You good? I'm good. For the first time in too long, the words felt almost true. There was a beat of companionable quiet between them. The band's wheezing music drifted up the stairs. You should come out with us after the show, Emmett said. I know you don't love Mika's friends, but... What's not to love? Leopold cut him off. The last time we hung out, Jessica told me I had the potential to be hot, but no hope of being memorable. Damn. Emmett's eyes dimmed, then brightened. She said you had potential, though. Leopold was smiling as he said, dickhead. Potential in a three-piece suit. Emmett nodded at Leopold's still damp clothes. You're looking dapper as a rich murder victim, Mr. Berry. Leopold laughed despite himself. All right, whatever, I'll come. I'm not ready to go home and deal with Richter yet anyway. Yes. Emmett fist pumped as they headed for the exit. It'll be the best night of your life, I promise. We're going to eat shitty diner food and talk about noise bands, aren't we? Emmett briefly looked back. Like I said. Chapter 8. The typewriters cranked out some more noise, then finished with a funereal rendition of Britney Spears' Toxic, the lyrics sung in Latin. It wasn't quite 9 o'clock. Leopold's phone had been buzzing with angry messages from his father, get your ass home, and so on, until finally he just silenced it. As a small crowd cleared out, Leopold and Emmett clustered by the juice bar to pick a restaurant. Joining them were Mika and 2 of her bandmates, Clark and the aforementioned Jessica, the phone book ripper and musical saw player, respectively. Leopold had lifted his hand in limp hellos, and though Clark acknowledged him with an uncertain look, Jessica had tucked her platinum blonde hair behind her ears and said, without cruelty, Have we met before? The typewriters had shed their white jumpsuits and were now dressed like standard art kids in band shirts and shapeless light-washed mom jeans, except for Mika, who paired her band shirt, weirdo rippers, with a tan canvas pants and ugly on-purpose Teva sandals from the 90s. The pants, Mika never tired of explaining, were from a store in Panorama City called Pants Town, which sold unironic workwear in bulk and had been experiencing a recent and baffling influx of teenagers. Leopold thought she looked good despite her clothes, but because he tried not to dwell on Mika's attractiveness, she being Emmett's girlfriend and everything, he pretended to study the juice bar menu and turned his thoughts to food. He hadn't eaten since breakfast and was suddenly ravenous. Clifton's, Emmett suggested, now dressed in the white tee and black jeans he'd been wearing under his jumpsuit. The perch, Clark countered. Jessica wrinkled her nose. Too expensive. You have a trust fund, Clark pointed out. Not until I'm 25. So, Clifton's, Emmett insisted. Clark looked defeated. I'm so old. It's so old. Leopold just watched, amused. He knew where this was heading. Z Cafe, Mika suggested, then waved her hand and said, never mind, before anyone could respond. 2 avocado toast. I thought you liked avocado toast, Clark said. Do you know how water-intensive avocado farming is? Do you hear me giving you shit about all those almonds you eat? I don't know why we go through this when we always end up at either the pantry or Clifton's, Jessica whined. No pantry, said Mika, crossing her arms. There's meat in everything, and I'm vegan this month. Clifton's it is, Emmett crowed. Chapter 9. Clifton was 20 blocks from the stench, at the foot of Bunker Hill, below the high-rises, wedged between a liquidator of second-hand mannequins and an old theatre that hadn't shown a movie since Charlie Chaplin was starring in them. Clifton's was nearly as ancient, which, for Emmett, was half the attraction. He was an aficionado of LA history and, by extension, a connoisseur of quirky old LA diners. His favorites looked like somewhere a 1930s hobo would cough up his last dime for a ham sandwich and a cup of coffee. Clifton's food was barely a notch above school cafeteria fare, and the menu hadn't changed in half a century, but neither, it seemed, had its prices. For that reason alone, it usually won out. Leopold found parking down the block, clubbed his wheel, noted the new number on Bessie's odometer, 7,274 miles. That met Emmett and the typewriters in front of the restaurant. They were doing a post-mortem on the show, which Leopold tuned out as he pushed open a heavy log cabin door and held it for the others. Stepping inside Clifton's was like entering a magical forest, albeit one that had been neglected for years. There were fake shrubs everywhere, fake streams that flowed with heavy chlorinated water, fake woodland creatures that peeped out from the branches of fake trees. The place was nearly empty, but for a few tipsy 30-somethings and a man in a heavy coat who appeared to be asleep at his table. Clifton's was the rare survivor from an era where every third restaurant in LA was like a miniature Disneyland without the rides. Its theme was enchanted redwoods, and though at one time it might really have felt magical, it was now faded and sort of depressing. Leopold figured it would fold in a year or two and give way to some avocado toast place. It was the way of things. A yawning hostess escorted them to their usual table, a curved brown booth built in the hollow of a giant plastered tree. Its trunk rose halfway up the wall before melding into a painted mural of a redwood grove. A waiter with a graying comb-over brought menus and took drink orders. Leopold asked for black coffee. For a while, Mika and Co. talked about the noise bans, which allowed Leopold to zone out and sip his coffee. Then the conversation turned to college applications. It seemed like everyone already had it figured out, their whole unimaginable life in all its snaking turns, or the next few bends of it anyway. Jessica would be pre-med at one of the better UCs. Clark was a legacy at some private liberal arts college in the Midwest. And Mika was taking a gap year to backpack around Europe, having convinced her parents that she needed to study her soul before deciding what to study in college. Emmett was almost certainly going to either Stanford or Caltech, and it was easy to imagine him becoming a rocket scientist like his parents. Leopold, meanwhile, was trying to figure out what to say about his own murky future when the waiter came back to take their food orders, and he was granted a stay of execution. I think I'll have the salmon, Jessica said after a cursory look at the giant laminated menu. Is it wild or farmed? The waiter scowled. Microwaved. Emmett nudged Leopold. You know what you want? Not yet, he said quietly. Sometimes, when his eyes popped open and his heart set to racing at 3 a.m, Leopold knew exactly what he wanted. For his mother to come back to life. It was a notion so impossible, even his disordered middle-of-the-night mind knew it to be absurd. And yet it sometimes occurred to him, in clearer moments, that his troubling visions of Sunder had been birthed in retaliation to this fact. That if it couldn't live in a world where his mother was alive, perhaps he could live in another world altogether. It was childish and stupid and embarrassing. The fantasy of Sunder every bit as fake as the tree whose planted trunk they were sitting inside. But he couldn't figure out how to let it go. He lowered his head, turning a page in the menu. Mika, too, was taking forever to decide. Everyone was giving her advice. The chicken fried steak is excellent, Emmett said, then reversed himself when Mika made a face. Right, you're vegan. Greek salad, Jessica suggested. That's on page 6, Clark looked horrified. Geriatric diner rule number 1. Never order anything after page 4. Past that, you're taking your life into your own hands. Inexplicably, a strange sensation had begun to steal over Leopold. A leadenness in his limbs and a lightness in his head. He blinked at his dinner options, trying to effect outward calm, and noticed that someone had defaced his menu. In blue ballpoint, above the list of appetizers was a doodle of a man with a big nose peering over the top of a wall. Kilroy. Leopold's face felt warm. Suddenly, he was 9 years old again. 10, 11. The big-nosed man had been a wink shed between him and his mother. Only later had Leopold learned of its origins, as a bit of an inside joke graffiti left behind by Allied soldiers during World War II, often accompanied by the words, "Kilroy was here." For Leopold and his mother, it began when she created a word search for him on the back of a restaurant menu with Kilroy. Why do I keep saying Killjoy? I apologize. Kilroy. Drawn at the top. He'd solved it quickly and requested another, and they'd sat there at Shakey's Pizza for 2 hours after their meal was done, passing paper menus back and forth, a little man at the top of each one. Word searches evolved into cipher puzzles, and eventually weekend-long scavenger hunts had led them all over the neighborhood. Often she wouldn't tell them there was a puzzle to solve. That became part of the game. But Kilroy, chalked on some unmissable square of sidewalk outside the house or drawn on a post-it stuck inside a book she knew he'd opened at school, was always her signal that something was afoot. It meant, essentially, pay attention. Leopold had never considered himself some kind of puzzle genius, or any kind of genius. But when his mother asked him to pay attention, he did. A sudden movement drew his gaze upward. Above Clifton's main floor was a second-floor atrium, roped off and rarely used. It was crowded with more tables and faux greenery, and Leopold thought he'd seen a trembling in the bushes there. The bush moved a second time. His head tingled as his eyes fixed on it. A furry, ring-eyed face popped out behind a limb and peered down at him. Nope. The goddamn raccoon again. It pressed its little hands against the glass wall barrier, eyes bleeding. Leopold clenched his jaw and willed it to disappear. Fuck off, Leopold hissed under his breath. You're not real. Excuse me? Clark said, turning to face him. Leopold quickly lowered his head. The crab cakes, he said, pretending to study the menu. They've got to be fake, right? I guess. Clark gave him a strange look, then returned to the conversation he'd been having with Jessica. When Leopold glanced up again, the raccoon was gone. He remembered, with a rush of relief, Emmett once telling him that most of the fake woodland creatures in Clifton's were animatronic. At some point in the restaurant's history, they'd all been functional, so that as you walked around, you might see a tin gopher poke its head out of a hole, or a wooden woodpecker tap on a tree. That would account for the raccoon. Maybe a few of them still worked. And for you? It was his turn to order. Leopold scanned his open menu for anything that didn't sound overtly poisonous. His gaze snagged on an item in red, sandwiched between the liver and onions and the shepherd's pie. 24. Go upstairs, Leopold. $6.95. He squeezed his eyes shut, opened them again. It was still there. He slapped the menu closed and handed it back to the waiter. I'm not hungry. Emmett frowned. You said you were starving. Must have been the coffee, appetite suppressant. Aware that he'd hardly touched it, he picked up the mug and took a long, bitter sip, then excused himself to the bathroom. Leopold could feel Emmett's gaze following him as he walked away, but he didn't look back. It was time to finish this. Leopold headed for the stairs. Chapter 10. The stairs that led to the second floor were carved to look like fallen logs. The red rope was stretched across the landing. Leopold checked over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, ducked under the rope, and hurried quietly up the rest of the steps. At the top was a closed door and a staff-only sign. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he was tired of doing nothing. The powerlessness he felt in the face of his own mental deterioration had become a tightening coil of anxiety around his throat. And if he didn't do something to take control of it now, he feared he might do something far more destructive later, like go home and punch Richter in the face. By comparison, opening a door in a musty diner seemed downright sensible. He ignored the sign and turned the handle. Inside was the atrium he'd seen from below. A thicket of plastic bushes stretched along a balcony to his left. Across a carpeted aisle, amber-tinted bulbs cast an eerie, irradiated glow off a dusty red booth. He walked along, peering into the tangle of greenery. There was no woodland creature, animatronic or otherwise, in sight. As usual, it had been all in his head. He dragged his hands down his face and cursed himself. Then something darted out into the aisle. That damn raccoon stood in the middle of the carpet, staring at him, taunting him. Clasped in its forepaws was something small and glinting. Leopold hesitated, then took a step forward. The raccoon turned, scampered toward a row of replica pines along the back wall, and dove into their branches. And where he'd officially lost his mind, Leopold chased after it anyway. When he'd reached the pines, he searched around, thinking he might find a small hole in the wall or in the floor. Instead, as he parted the branches, he discovered a doorway. Wedging himself awkwardly through a blind of pipe cleaner needles, Leopold emerged into a room-sized diorama of a pine forest. There were no tables or chairs, just artificial bushes, trees, rocks, and animals. A glass idea stood eternally frozen beside a dry stream. A beaver lay toppled beside a dam of sticks and branches. Birds pitched here and there, and the walls were painted in the style of Hollywood sets to look like woods that continued endlessly into the distance. At the far end of the room, a small window looked out onto the street, an odd intrusion of reality. Leopold turned slowly, scanning the scene. He'd nearly come full circle without finding the raccoon when he saw, right at eye level, a thin velvet rope that dangled from the ceiling. Attached to the bottom was a dainty, gilt-lettered sign that read, "Pull for show." Without stopping to question his choices, Leopold wrapped his hand around the cord and gave it a tug. He heard a muffled metallic whir from somewhere out of sight, and through hidden speakers came the distinctive pop and scratch of a record needle dropping onto vinyl. As a string orchestra began to play a warbling tune, a peppy male narrator intoned, "Ah, the majesty of nature! It has the power to soothe, to heal, to rejuvenate even the most harried denizens of the modern metropolis." Birds turned and twittered in the trees. The deer lowered its head with a rusty squeak to drink from the dry stream. To the sound of recorded breeze, a few branches moved up and down as if shifting in the wind. Leopold stood in the center of it all, so fascinated he nearly forgot about the raccoon. And for the patient observer, the narrator went on, for the acute of vision, something more awaits. For the camper, the hiker, the explorer, the adventurer, here is a ticket to another world. Across the room, the leaves of a small bush began to shiver. A moment later, the raccoon poked out its head. "So come, weary traveller, join us." Leopold moved cautiously toward the animal. The raccoon's head jerked from side to side. It didn't run, didn't seem to be aware of him at all. It was the same raccoon he'd been seeing all day, with the same distinctive markings, but now up close it appeared to be animatronic. Leopold crossed the room until finally he found himself standing right in front of it. His heart was drumming. The raccoon's head swiveled toward him. Its paws stuttered upwards, cupping in offering. They held a silver coin. With some trepidation, Leopold reached down and took the coin from the raccoon's stiff paws, then studied it in the reddish light. On one side was written, "Good for one ride." On the other, "Angel's Flight Railway." He stared at it for another long moment, then slowly raised his head. The room's only window was just a few feet away, framing a view of 8th Street and the steep rise of Bunker Hill, stippled with palms and sad apartment buildings. A narrow metal track ran straight up the middle, and stalled on the tracks not far from the bottom was a solitary red trolley car. Leopold had the sudden weightless feeling of having left his body. He'd seen this image many times before. This hill, those buildings, that trolley. It was a short from the opening credits of Sunderworld. He became aware, gradually at first, of a cool breeze across his skin. A kiss of fresh night air. Forest air. The pine bough beside the window had resumed its rustling, and the sound it made was gentler than before. A whisper, not a creak. Looking closely, he saw that it was not made from plaster and pipe cleaners, but real wood and real needles and real dripping sap, redolent of the outdoors. And then he looked at the raccoon, which lowered its paws and scratched itself without a trace of jerky awkwardness. He was about to speak to it when his name rang out. "Larry?" It was Emmett. He burst through the door in the wall of pines behind him, and the spell was broken. "What the hell is going on?" There was an abrupt grating screech from within the walls and a noise like gears stripping. The trees and animals around him began to shudder and shake, demonstrably mechanical again. The raccoon emitted a shrill whine that made Leopold wince, and then an electrical spark arced through the whirring behind its eyes. It caught fire. "Holy shit!" Emmett cried. Flames erupted from the raccoon's eye sockets, then quickly spread to its bristle-brush fur. Leopold tried to stomp it out and instead sent the thing tumbling stiffly into a bush. The fire roared, engulfing the fake shrubbery. Leopold tore off his suit jacket and threw it on the rill of flame that was spreading toward the pines, which were nothing but 90-year-old kindling. He and Emmett both stomped on it, but the jacket itself began to burn. Leopold had just decided to run for help when their waiter suddenly appeared in the doorway with a fire extinguisher. "Out of the way!" he bellowed, and sprayed the white foam until the extinguisher ran dry. In a few seconds it was over, and the air was filled with smoke and char and the stink of chemicals. The waiter rounded on them, his face flushed, his comb-over flopping down the wrong side of his head. "What were you doing in here?" he cried. "No one's allowed in here." They ran. Chapter 11. Emmett and Leopold raced down the fallen log stairs and through the ground floor of the restaurant. Leopold's head was a warring clangor of mortification, adrenaline, and a growing conviction that something bizarre, but important, had just happened. Somewhere behind him he heard Emmett bark, "Get the check and meet me outside," at their table, and Leopold pushed through the main door to find himself briefly alone on the sidewalk. He stood catching his breath in an eddying cloud of smoke from a taco cart, then held the coin up to a shaft of streetlight. Good for one ride. He hadn't imagined it. A hand grasped his shoulder and spun him around. What the hell happened back there? It was Emmett, winded and puffing. "What were you doing upstairs? You almost burned the place down." The token still clutched in his hand, Leopold saw the exasperation on his friend's face and knew, in his gut, that the best course of action was to lie. Instead, he told Emmett the truth. The story poured out in a jumble. The raccoon, number 24 on the menu, the hidden room and the scene that had come to life, the coin, and then Angel's flight, framed through the window in a nearly perfect recreation of one of Sunderworld's opening shots. "Let me see the coin," Emmett said when the story was over. He held out his palm, dubious. Leopold handed it over. After a few seconds of inspection, Emmett's expression mellowed from anger to bemused fascination. "There's a simple explanation for this." Leopold attempted a smile. "I just got invited to Sunder." Emmett's eyes were narrowed. He gave back the coin. The raccoon was obviously animatronic, and this token was part of some old promotional deal Clifton's used to have with the trolley operator. Like, you got a free ride up the hill if you ate at the restaurant and a free cup of coffee at Clifton's if you bought a trolley ride. Also, there used to be this little park with real redwood trees near the top of the hill, which explains the connection between the escape into the majesty of nature stuff with the trolley. Wait, Angel's Flight is a real thing? I thought it was invented for the show. Come on, man, it's a classic piece of LA history. Emmett rolled his eyes, tension leaving his body. The shortest and steepest railway in the country and the gateway to Bunker Hill, which used to be the fanciest neighborhood in Los Angeles. I'm honestly embarrassed for you that you don't know this. You still haven't read that book I gave you for your birthday? It was 500 pages! Whatever, it had pictures. Emmett turned to face the darkened lot across the street, then pointed. Beyond a chain-link fence, stalled in its track a short distance from the bottom of the hill, was a red trolley. You really never noticed it before? We walk past this trash heap every time we come to Clifton's. Oh. Leopold felt stupid. Yeah. Damn. Exactly. Leopold frowned. From their vantage point at the street level, the trolley was slightly obscured by palms. I guess I don't look up enough. There's a metaphor in there somewhere. Leopold sighed. So, it's a real thing. It was a real thing, but it hasn't worked in forever. I had another episode, he said, almost trying to convince himself. It was all in my head. Yeah, Emmett still looked a little angry. He tossed a look over his shoulder. I'll be lucky if they don't call the cops. Leopold felt himself losing this fight, his earlier adrenaline replaced by a cold mortification. He hadn't realized until that moment just how much he'd been hoping that the token would mean something. That all of it would finally mean something. What about the trolley I thought I saw when I was driving with my dad? Didn't you say that happened by Carney's? Yeah. Carney's is an old streetcar, just like the Formosa Cafe and the Pacific Dining Car, and like 3 other restaurants around town. You did see one, it just wasn't flying across Sunset Strip. But the raccoon upstairs catching fire, Leopold said, trying again. It was almost identical to the one I saw this morning. Emmett was shaking his head. Tonight was probably the first time that whole Disneyland on acid scene had been switched on in years. I wasn't Sunder trying to tap you on the shoulder. Thumper and Bambi would have caught fire no matter who pulled the rope in the ceiling. Okay, Leopold said, nodding because it was the expected thing to do, the sane thing to do. But inside he was spiraling. Emmett raised his eyebrows. You need me to point out any more flaws in your logic? They were pacing now, passing in and out of the taco cart's ghostly smoke. No. Yes. Wait. The raccoon handed me an entry token, Leopold said in a rush. And then, like the scene where the coyote gives Max a key to Sunder, it vanishes in a puff of flame, Emmett finished for him. I thought it was a shower of sparks. No, it was definitely a puff of flame, Emmett insisted. We recreated that scene shot for shot, remember? With a red smoke bomb from the Army-Navy store and everything. Okay, a puff of flame, Leopold said, his mind working. And you don't think it's strange that the same exact thing happened in front of me 5 minutes ago? He held up the coin. An entry token is a kind of key. Look, Emmett sighed, deflating. You had an intense day. When you're already on edge, small coincidences can feel bigger than they really are. I wouldn't call them small. It's not a key, Emmett said slowly, emphasizing each word. Can we at least acknowledge that this has been weird? A little uncanny, slightly out of the fucking ordinary? No. Emmett halted and turned to face him. I'm not going to encourage this. It isn't healthy. You just had a serious episode, and instead of asking for help, you ran off after some malfunctioning raccoon and almost burned down my favorite restaurant. I know, I'm sorry. I think we should recognize that something strange is happening. In your head? Yeah, something strange is happening in your head. Leopold flinched. Come on, man. Listen, I'm sorry, Emmett sighed. The anger seemed to leave him, but not the intensity. I'm not trying to be an asshole, I swear, but I'm not a therapist. Everything I know I learned from the internet or listening to Mika about things her own therapist taught her. I don't know how to help you with this anymore, and I think... Larry, I think you need to talk to Richter about seeing a professional again. I'm worried about you. Leopold nodded, trying to look calm, but he felt like he'd been punched in the chest. Emmett was literally taking a step back from him, and the worst part was that Leopold understood why. He knew how he must have seemed. He knew magic wasn't real, and he knew deep down that Sunder wasn't either. But it was the very fact that he could recognize this cognitive dissonance in himself that gave him pause. Because how could he be logical and illogical at the same time? Leopold shoved his trembling hands into his pockets, the metal token biting into his closed fist. If he wasn't careful, he was going to lose Emmett, which somehow felt worse than losing his mind. He took a centering breath and stared across the street at Angel's Flight. The lot below it heaped with trash, its tracks overgrown with weeds, the congregation of grimy palms standing sentinel around its base. The trolley clearly hadn't been operational in years, and it certainly wasn't about to transport him anywhere tonight, token or no token. You're right, Leopold said finally. You're right about all of it. I got wound up today, and instead of resisting the shitstorm, I leaned into it. Old habits, bad habits. He shook his head. And I'm sorry I didn't say anything before. If it happens again, I will. I promise. You promised before. I mean it this time. Leopold held out his hand with the pinky up. Emmett glowered at it. What's this supposed to be? It's a fucking pinky promise. Emmett stared at him for a moment. Then he slapped Leopold's hand out of the way and pulled him in for a quick, crushing hug. Soon they were both smiling. You really okay? Emmett asked, her gaze narrowing. Yeah, I think I just needed to talk through this stuff out loud. Emmett held up his hands. In that case, I hereby acknowledge a small, totally coincident amount of uncanny weirdness. Now, your turn. He nodded at the token still clutched in Leopold's hand. Repeat after me. This is not a key. Leopold rolled his eyes. This is not a key. Emmett pointed to Angel's Flight. That is not an entrance to Sunder. That is not an entrance to Sunder. He poked Leopold in the chest. I, Leopold Berry, am not going to try to ride Angel's Flight. I, Leopold Berry, am not going to try to ride Angel's Flight. It doesn't work anyway. Probably a total death trap. I said I'm not going to. Good. Emmett clapped him on the arm. We good? Leopold nodded. Sorry, I probably got us banned from Clifton's. Oh, you definitely got us banned. It's for the best, though. That food was going to kill us eventually. Leopold rubbed his face, suddenly exhausted. When he looked up, the fake log door to Clifton's had swung open, and Mika and her friends were trailing out into the sidewalk holding on to-go boxes. What's going on with you two? Mika called out, leading the others towards them at a leisurely pace. Leopold was about to hook up with the red flags, said Emmett, grinning. I had to stop him. Mika raised a skeptical brow at Leopold and his bedraggled appearance. He was still wearing the remnants of his ill-fitting three-piece suit. The jacket had been sacrificed to the fire, but his vest, white shirt and slacks, all wrinkled and soot-stained, continued to do him no favors. She laughed, but in a confused way. Okay. If that's true, said Clark, then why was the waiter so freaked out? He kept asking if we were going to sue. Sue? Leopold raised his eyebrows. Is that why they didn't call the... Oof. Emmett had elbowed him in the gut. Yeah, Jessica went on. He said something about faulty wiring upstairs. Right, exactly, said Emmett, improvising. I told Larry it was a bad idea to take a girl up there. Zero atmosphere. Wasn't even sanitary. Now Mika looked disgusted, and Leopold, whose book of romantic history contained no more than 2 uneventful chapters, was beginning to worry the story was taking a wrong turn. Cheeks flushing, he shot Emmett a warning look and said, "All right, that's enough." "You're a good friend," Jessica said to Emmett, before turning a sympathetic gaze on Leopold. She's objectively beautiful, so it made sense that she could never remember him. "Bad hookups can't fix a bad day. And you," she looked him up and down, "you look like you've had a really bad day." Leopold frowned. "Yeah." "You know, you could be hot if you made an effort," she said, tilting her head at him. "You got great hair. What's your name again?" "All right, I'm going home," Leopold announced, turning away from Jessica. Emmett looked disappointed. "You sure? You could crash at my place tonight. We'll do breakfast at Jerry's. We're going to need a new shitty diner." Leopold shook his head. He knew Richter would blow a gasket when he finally showed his face at home, but he needed to start dealing with his problems instead of running from them. Avoiding the reality of his mum's death was what had started him down this path to this bleak moment, and Leopold was determined to stop repeating the same mistakes. He sure as hell wasn't going to let Richter break his mind. Leopold Berry might have been perfectly average, but he wasn't a fucking coward. Chapter 12. Leopold crossed the street and hurried toward his Volvo. The solitary car hissed by, passing in and out of streetlights as it splashed through the remnants of the afternoon's rain. He was relieved to find Bessie just where he'd left her, windows unbroken. He got in and unlocked the club from his wheel. A lonely siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Drawing in a deep breath, he counted to 5, then slowly exhaled. Today had been shit. Tomorrow he would start over. As he pulled his keys from his pocket, he noticed the dark smudge on the vinyl that wrapped the steering column. He frowned and turned on the dome light. There was a second blackened mark below the door handle. Both had been imprinted upon the places his hands had come to rest after he'd imagined, a shower of red sparks. He rubbed his knuckle along one of the marks, and it smeared. Soot. He felt his face getting hot. His scalp began to tingle. No, not again. Never again. He clenched his teeth, fumbling the key into the ignition just as someone rapped hard on his window, startling Leopold so badly he hit his head against the ceiling. It was Emmett. Leopold cranked down the window, his pulse suddenly racing. Streetlight cast a harsh glare across Emmett's shoulders. There was a strange, intense look on his face. "Mr. Berry," he said, his voice grave, "we have a problem." Chapter 13. They stood on the sidewalk, hands cupped around their eyes, peering through the chain-link fence. Above them loomed Angel's Flight, beyond which they could make out the shadowy, weed-fringed rise of Bunker Hill. Leopold broke the silence. "We've been standing here a full minute. Are you going to explain why you dragged me back here?" "Just look," Emmett said anxiously, pointing into the gloom. "Halfway up, right side. What do you see?" Leopold squinted. "Crappy apartment buildings?" "And there." Emmett's arm shifted higher and to the left. "What about over there?" "I don't know, man. It's pretty dark." "How about a huge building with what looks like a crown on top?" "The U.S. Bank Tower." "No." "Do you see any tall buildings at all?" He was gesturing toward the crest of the hill now, cloaked in a fine shroud of mist. "There should be a bunch of skyscrapers." "Yeah." Leopold hesitated, then frowned. "I mean, no, I don't see any of that." "That's what I'm saying. Where the hell did they go?" Leopold blinked at Emmett. "What do you mean?" "What do you mean, what do I mean?" He was getting frustrated. "They're gone." Leopold turned to face his friend. Emmett's eyes were wide, his expression bordering on panic. Emmett was freaking out, and Emmett never freaked out. "Buildings don't just disappear," Leopold said slowly. "Great, yeah, let's make a list of other obvious facts." Emmett shot him a stony look before returning his eyes to the hill. "First, buildings don't just disappear. Second, I know what the downtown LA skyline is supposed to look like, and that's not it." "What are you trying to say? A minute ago you were giving me this big speech about how all this weirdness was just coincidental. Now you're making me think my episodes are contagious." Emmett was shaking his head. "I realize I just spent hours telling you that what you've been seeing isn't real. But I'm not seeing, like, half-human monsters outside motels. This feels like a cosmic problem. I was born and raised in this beautiful, disgusting city, and it's never looked like that." He nodded toward the hill again, then took a deep breath. "There might be more than just a tiny bit of uncanny weirdness happening right now. And I need to know why." A snap of silent lightning split the night sky. They turned at the same time to gaze at Angel's Flight. Inside the trolley, dimly, a light was burning. For a moment, neither boy drew breath. "Holy shit," Leopold said softly. Emmett turned to him. "You still have that token, right?" Chapter 14. Neither of them spoke as they jumped the flimsy fence, the sound of metal jangling as they landed on the filthy ground. They navigated a maze of garbage, then ran up 50 feet of steep, rutted track to the back of Angel's Flight. They stood together on its rear step, winded and grasping a rusted rail as they peered through its door, open to the elements. They exchanged a look before ducking inside, Emmett leading the way. A single bulb in a wire cage cast weak light from the ceiling. 2 rows of scarred wooden benches faced off across a long aisle of stairs, rising from one end of the car to the other at a 45-degree angle. Trash lay in scattered heaps. Crumpled newspapers, piles of clothing, empty cans. Graffiti crawled across the cracked windows. At the high end of the car, beside the operator's seat, was a panel of levers and switches. "Here," Emmett called, jogging up the steps, Leopold close behind him. "There's got to be a place to drop the token somewhere." "Wait," Leopold hesitated, gazing at the token in his hand. The bulb above them flickered. Moonlight slanted through the trolley, illuminating movement along the trash. A rat skittering across the aisle. "This doesn't feel right." Emmett turned back to face him. "What do you mean?" Leopold swayed briefly before catching himself against one of the hard benches. Something slick smeared his sleeve and a shudder of revulsion shuddered through him. He stared again at the token. This was everything he'd wanted for so long. Emmett was all but admitting that Sunder might be real, that they might be on the precipice of discovering the world he'd dreamed about for years. But it wasn't supposed to happen like this. Max, of Max's Adventures in Sunderworld, had ridden Angel's Flight, yes, but he hadn't been forced to jump a chain-link fence and tear a hole through his shirt to reach it. He hadn't waded through piles of filth or described the ride to Sunder as smelling vaguely of dried vomit and urine. The door beneath the overpass had led straight to a clean, orderly trolley station, where a friendly conductor had been waiting to escort him onto Angel's Flight. "You okay?" Emmett prompted. "You ready?" Where was the friendly conductor? The welcome delegation? Then again, when would Leopold have had another chance like this? A moment where he and Emmett were aligned, both of them ready to take a risk on Sunder at the same time. "Yeah," Leopold said, his chest constricting. "Yeah, okay, I'm ready." They crowded around the switch panel. There it was, beside a big brass lever, a coin slot. Pale blue light pulsed dimly within. Leopold refused to overthink it. Steadying the slight tremor in his hand, he lifted the token to the slot and let it drop. He heard Emmett's breath catch just as the ceiling light went out, and they were plunged all at once into darkness. Immediately, the floorboards began to vibrate, and a series of loud, startling clanks resounded beneath their feet. Before either of them could speak, the trolley shuddered violently into motion. They stumbled and fell onto the benches behind them, so that they were facing one another across the aisle. A sharp crackle issued from ancient speakers in the ceiling, followed by a tinny recorded voice. "Welcome aboard Angel's Flight. We're glad you could join us. To ensure your safety, please ensure all hands, arms, limbs, and other appendages remain fully inside the conveyance." Leopold could have sworn it was the same even-toned voice that had narrated the scene upstairs in Clifton's. With another bone-rattling jolt, they were grinding up the hill, the trolley tilting precariously to one side as it picked up speed. "Find something to hang on to," Emmett said urgently, his eyes tracking the darkened windows. Leopold grabbed one of the handrails, his palms slick and clammy. "Emmett, when you said this thing was a death trap, you were exaggerating, right?" Emmett shook his head. "A few years ago, the trolley fell off its tracks and killed a bunch of tourists." A knot of dread was expanding in Leopold's chest. "Did they fix it? Does it look like they fixed it? Why do you think it was fenced off?" The tram was fairly rocketing up the hill now, squealing and clattering as it went, wheels barely clinging to the weed-choked scribble of track. Leopold searched frantically for an emergency brake in the dark. There was a sudden dramatic pressure change, a sharp pain building in Leopold's ears before they finally popped, and the stomach-churning moment of weightlessness. It felt briefly like the trolley had lifted off the ground, and Leopold, who had never gotten motion sickness, thought he might throw up. Through the windows, he could make out a passing impression of shadowy buildings and what seemed to be a grove of tall, thick-trunked trees. And then, with a jolt, they were slowing, only their tight grip on the handrails preventing them from being thrown to the floor. There was a dissonant chorus of brakes. With a long shriek of protest, they came to a stop. Finally, it was quiet. Chapter 15. Leopold rose unsteadily to his feet. From the trolley's cracked windows, he could see, through settling coils of dust, a small platform that extended to white-tiled walls. They were in some kind of station. The speakers in the ceiling crackled, and a door to one side of the operator's seat folded open with a sudden slap. "Thank you for riding Angel's Flight. Please take a moment to collect your belongings before disembarking. And don't forget to..." The last few words were garbled, and then the speakers fell silent. Leopold and Emmett stumbled off the trolley in a daze, their shoes kicking bits of trash on the steps as they descended onto the platform. The station was pungent and dilapidated. The floor was laid with grime. A row of broken benches lay tipped in a corner. The high ceiling was arched with curving wooden beams skinned in dust and cobwebs, through which the few glass-domed lights still working cast a hesitant greenish glow. This desolate place would have been the worst kind of disappointment except for 2 words, faintly illuminated on the wall in front of them, rendered in blocky blue tile. Sunder Hill. "Bro," Emmett said quietly, his eyes fixed on the sign as he backhanded Leopold in the chest. Leopold absorbed the blow, blinking hard. He tapped the floor with his foot. It felt solid. The sound echoed. He was pretty sure he wasn't dreaming. "What the hell?" he whispered. They heard a distant car horn and turned toward the sound. It had come from a corridor blocked by a turnstile from which other city noises murmured faintly. Emmett cocked his head toward the corridor and Leopold nodded. Wordlessly, they crossed the station, their shoes leaving tracks in the dust. Emmett pushed through the turnstile, its metal teeth revolving with a sharp click-clack. As Leopold took his turn, he saw a small analog counter in the stanchion flip on from one unreadable runic-looking character to another. He reached out and slid a handle on the wall tiles as they went, feeling their coolness. The corridor ranked upwards, and as they followed its gently spiraling path, a golden pink light became visible ahead. The city sounds grew louder, another horn. A siren rose and quickly faded, its odd, song-like wail strangely familiar. They came to a halt at an arched doorway, just beyond were a city street and a strip of sky. Pink sky. The boys traded a heavy, loaded look. Emmett took the first step out into the unknown, and after a moment, Leopold followed. Chapter 16. They couldn't stop staring at the sky. When they boarded Angel's Flight, it had been fairly dark. Here, the sky was a dusky, pinkish gold. Above the flats of downtown from which they'd recently arrived, the heavens were a black canvas brushed with moonlit clouds. If he squinted, Leopold could see the outlines of squat buildings gleaming down there in the night, distant constellations of windows lit from within. But up here, at this eerie trolley station atop the hill, an island of cottony pink luster hovered overhead, bathing the palm-fringed streets around them in a soft, shadowless glow. Leopold realized with a sudden jolt and a subsequent shiver that he'd seen this phenomenon before. He'd seen it in an episode of Sunderworld. Drawing a tight breath, he turned to stare at a 3-story apartment building directly across the street, all stained glass and curving turquoise with tilework. This, too, he recognized. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" Emmett asked, his voice faint. Leopold's face was tingling as he croaked. "Yeah." It was an Art Deco masterpiece floating 30 feet off the ground, pipes and wires dangling from the foundation. A few elderly cars were parked in a gravel lot underneath it, their owners apparently unconcerned about their vehicles being crushed. "Alta Vista Hotel," read the large electric sign in front. "Come for the value, stay for the views." Emmett laughed nervously. Leopold pivoted, only to find his friend was already yards away, turning in circles to take it all in. Along the street, the salmon-hued clouds merged with a block-long riot of color and light. Flashing marquees, glaring billboards, and glimmering shop windows all competing for their overtaxed attention. An enormous, long-finned car from another era whooshed by, but there didn't seem to be anyone at the wheel. Leopold's eyes darted from one shiny thing to another. A window sign that read accounting, tax preparation, divination. Beside a neon crystal ball, a store called Best Quality Magic Doors and Portal Repair, Inc. A shaggy-haired man in sunglasses whistling as he passed them, taking what appeared to be a bush for a walk on a leash. Leopold tripped along after Emmett, absorbing the scene with dizzy wonder. There was a cafe filled with water, chairs and tables bobbing like pool toys near the ceiling, rivulets escaping under the door and running across the sidewalk. The 7 C's read the gilt-etched window, closed for maintenance. A woman in a high-collared coat brushed past, pursued by 3 shopping bags. I felt like he'd stumbled into an old recurring dream. Dizzyingly strange, but uncannily familiar too, the edges and details gone fuzzy. He was certain he'd never been here before, yet the many bizarre sights bombarding him didn't feel entirely alien. A shop window across the street caught his eye. Emmett, he practically shouted, pointing at its neon sign. Is that Norm's magic horn? Emmett jogged over in stunned slow motion, his eyes wide as he turned to look. Shut the hell up. Spotlighted in the window was a mannequin holding what looked like a sagging shadow over its shoulder. The sign beside it read, Portable hole, gently used. Ask about financing. Emmett pressed his nose against the window. I always wanted one of those, he said, breath fogging the glass. A wild-haired man in a huge brown cardigan came suddenly into view. We're closed, he shouted from inside, rapping sharply on the window. Come back tomorrow. Emmett jumped back so quickly he nearly sprained an ankle. When he'd recovered his balance, the two boys bolted down the sidewalk. After a brief sprint, they collapsed against another building. Leopold felt an inappropriate giggle building in his chest. He covered his mouth, but it couldn't be contained. Larry, Emmett said, his tone a warning, pull yourself together. I can't. Leopold shook his head, a high-pitched laugh escaping. I'm freaking out. Me too. Leopold made an effort to calm himself, but he couldn't stop shaking his head. You don't understand. I promised myself I would move past this, that I wouldn't lean into the visions anymore. Emmett picked up a discarded soda can from the ground, then turned the label for Leopold to see. Etherblast was printed on it in bold letters. You think this is a vision? He squinted at the fine print. Extends casting effectiveness up to 3 hours. You're telling me this is fake? Yes? Emmett tossed the can away. It rattled across the pavement. I'm the logical one, Larry. He poked himself in the chest. And logically speaking, two people can't hallucinate the same thing at the same time. We're in L.A. Leopold tossed up his hands, sounding a little desperate even to himself. What's more likely that we're in Sunder, that magic is real and my childhood fantasy come true, or that we're on some weird elaborate studio backlot? I don't know. Emmett's gaze had fixed on a nearby storefront. On its roof stood a massive lighted T. The letter by itself made no sense, but the jaunty neon sign on the door was simply enough to understand information. But there's one way to find out. Chapter 17. The place was small, just a short counter found with colourful pamphlets, a few posters on the wall. Experience the Sunderhoods of SoCal. Take a trip via Tumbleport. A gentle thrumming sound emanated from a short corridor at the back. There didn't seem to be anyone around. Leopold noticed a desk bell on the counter and gave it a tap. It let out a surprisingly loud, resonant ding. After a moment, they heard what sounded like footsteps approaching. Not from the corridor, but from underground. From the center of the room came a loud crack of a bolt sliding. A door in the floor swung open on a squeaking hinge, and then the top few rungs of a ladder rose up as if on a spring. What? Emmett said, pointing, but that was all he could manage before a hand appeared on the ladder, followed by a red-sleeved arm and a head with a matching red cap atop it. Then a whole person was climbing out of the floor, a young man in what appeared to be a bellhop's uniform. Keep the coffee hot, he called down the ladder. He dumped an armload of pamphlets into a box under the counter, shoved the ladder back down with one foot, and kicked the door shut with a bang. With all this accomplished, he pulled his jacket straight, nudging the cap on his head to a slight angle, and turned his face to them with a chipper smile. Sorry to keep you folks waiting. You caught me on my 2-minute break. He laughed to show it was no big deal. Name's Art, he said, tapping the name tag on his jacket. And you've just arrived, if I'm not mistaken. Emmett balked. How'd you know? I can always tell, Art said with a wink. Something in the eyes, stunned by the majesty of it all. All of the noise and the smog, depending on where you're in from. Where are you in from, if you don't mind me asking? In from? Echoed Leopold. Which Sunder, I mean to say. Emmett began. We're just from regular old... Iowa, Leopold interjected, instinct advising him to lie. The Iowa one? Art squinted, then snapped his fingers. Right, Dubuque. Sometimes I forget we have Sunders out in the flyover country. No offense meant and none taken, I hope. Not a spark of community, Dubuque. Though I suppose none are compared to good old Los Angeles. He pronounced it Anglese. Biggest and best in the whole U.S. Though I'm biased, of course. Either of you been to Sunder Hill before? They both shook their heads. Well, on behalf of the Department of Inter-Sunder Cooperation and Commerce, welcome in. You caught us short-staffed today, but I'm happy to give you the nickel tour. So if you've got any questions... He pointed to a button on his jacket that read, Ask Me. Leopold cleared his throat. Well, he cleared his throat again. I guess, just to be clear, we're definitely in, he laughed nervously. Sunderworld right now? Art frowned. You mean Sunder Hill? Yeah. Emmett shot Leopold a look. Sunder Hill, that's what we meant. Art peered curiously at the boys as if sensing something was off. Yes, this is... He was interrupted by a loud bang, which drew Leopold's attention down the short rear corridor, where he glimpsed a few large industrial-looking washers and dryers in an adjacent room. There's a laundromat back there, said Leopold. I thought this was an information post. Information post / Tumbleport station, Art corrected. Not technically a laundromat, though there was enough confusion on the matter that we decided to offer the option. Washers and dryers down that aisle, Tumbleport's over there. He nodded toward the connecting room. Leopold craned his neck to get a better look. Tumbleports had figured briefly in an episode of Sunderworld. An old lady dozed beside one in a plastic chair, the curls of her blue perm vibrating against the whirring machine. Now, pardon my confusion, Art went on, his brow furrowed. But if you came all the way from Dubuque and didn't arrive via Tumbleport, he nodded again at the machines, then how did you... Leopold startled as one of the Tumbleports flew open, releasing a cloud of grey smoke. A middle-aged man in a suit crawled out, coughing and swearing. Damn thing's defective! Art rushed over to help him, Leopold and Emmett shifting for a better view of the commotion. The man was covered in mud and cobwebs. He stood up, furiously trying to brush off his clothes while Art fussed over him. Let me help you, sir. Get off me, you imbecile! I had an important meeting in Poughkeepsie. Ended up in Madagascar. 6 hours in the jungle, missed the whole conference, ruined my best traveling suit. I'm very sorry, sir. Do you know how big the insects are in Madagascar? He cried. Art wrung his hands. I don't, sir, but I'm sure the Department of Transportation will pay for your suit to be cleaned. A lot of good that'll do me. I already missed the meeting. And that's not the worst of it. Look at my focuser. He reached into the machine and pulled out what looked like a smashed camera lens. This was a Leica! Leopold stared. He dreamed this whole young life of owning a focuser like that. He and Emmett had made countless prop versions from old magnifying glasses and broken thrift store telescopes. I'm sure you'll be compensated, sir. I want this problem fixed. Do you think I have time to cross the country on a damned airplane? He was scraping clumps of mud from his clothes and tossing them at Art's feet. I suppose they'll blame it on the ether drought, like everything else. Well, I'm sick of it. Don't I pay my taxes? This place is falling apart. With that, he stormed toward the exit without so much as a glance at Leopold and Emmett, slamming the door so hard a banner fell off the wall. Leopold read it before it folded over on itself. Keep LA magical. Be ether-wise. Ether, even a casual fan of Sunderworld knew, was the fuel without which spells could not be cast and magical objects could not function. It occurred naturally in trace amounts in the air, the rain, certain foods, and the bodies of sparks, but the most potent variety was drilled from deposits buried deep in the earth. Art turned to face them, looking sheepish. I'm terribly sorry you had to witness that. He produced a small sign from his jacket that read, Out of Ether, and went to set it on the broken machine. Leopold and Emmett traded nervous looks. They didn't know anything about ether drought, but it was clear they needed to leave before Art started asking more questions they couldn't answer. Well, we better get out of your way, Leopold said. I'm sure you've got a lot to do. Now, wait a second, said Art. We didn't finish the tour. Emmett was shaking his head as they backed towards the door. Sorry, we're meeting friends for, the dinner. Oh, Art said, straightening. I see. He studied the boys, a trace of suspicion still lingering in his eyes. Then, glancing once more at the smoking Tumbleport, he seemed to make a decision, then herded them out the door and onto the sidewalk without further interrogation. Well, thanks, said Leopold, for the information. Art nodded, pasted on a thin smile, and shoved a plastic bag into Leopold's hands. I can't let you leave without your welcome kit. Inside, you'll find 1 token each for Angel's Flight. Hasn't worked in years, but it's a Sunderhill tradition, so consider them souvenirs, and a coupon for a complimentary meal at the Bright Spot. He gestured to a diner down the block, its neon sign glowing orange against the dusky sky. Try a pie, stay clear of the soup, and tell him Art sent you. Any more questions, or if you need anything else, my card's in there too. Reach out anytime, living or dead. I mean, day or night. He seemed in a hurry to get back inside. And if a survey ghoul visits you, I hope you'll rate me 5 out of 5 stars. Have a great night. Enjoy your time in Sunder. Chapter 18. Leopold and Emmett stood in front of the Bright Spot, a warm but weathered greasy spoon that exuded coziness. Anything served any time was chalked on a sign in its curtained window, through which they could see people snugged into booths and clustered around tables. They only stared, neither of them saying a word. At the sound of a bell, the glass door swung open. An older gentleman in a precariously tall hat emerged and nodded in their direction. Coming in. With a glance at his friend, Leopold seemed to emerge from a trance, then moved slowly towards the entrance. He mumbled a thanks to the stranger, then held the door for Emmett, who took another beat to thaw. Once inside, Leopold was enveloped by the smell of frying eggs. The place presented in many ways like 100 diners he'd patronized in LA. The aroma of overbrewed coffee, the warm hum of conversation, the clink of silverware. Snug red booths lined the wall. A long counter bisected the room, waitresses in uniform bustling back and forth behind it, balancing plates of food. And yet, there was something distinctly unique about this place. The sign on the wall read, "No slack devices allowed." A man in a western jacket dug into a plate of food as he scanned the newspaper that hovered before him, the pages turning on their own. A waitress stopped to warm up his coffee, and as she poured it, a scintillating puff of silver sparks shot up from his mug. "This place is amazing," Emmett whispered. Leopold nodded in mute agreement. Then, feeling like his limbs had gone numb, he wobbled over to a booth and collapsed into it, his bones having taken on the consistency of jelly. Emmett, still fully in possession of his bones, sat down normally, then stared across the table at Leopold. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, what?" "Okay." Emmett leaned forward, his elbows splayed across the chip-brown formica. "You were right." "I was right?" That strange thing was still happening to Leopold's extremities, his limbs going heavy and his skin prickling. "About everything. I'm never right about everything. Larry, look at me." Leopold couldn't. He was staring down at the menus, the 2 tomes as fat as dictionaries, then up at the ceiling, where bumpy, yellowing tiles were silently rearranging themselves for no obvious reason. A young couple at the next booth sat shoulder to shoulder, chuckling as they watched images dance in the lens of a shared etherfocuser. For a moment, Leopold wasn't sure whether he wanted this to be real. "Larry!" Emmett snapped his fingers in front of Leopold's face. "Don't freak out on me again." Leopold shook his head. "I won't. I'm not." "Listen, this changes everything." "Hi there," came a cheerful voice. A waitress with horn-rimmed glasses and bob-brown hair stood at their booth, chewing gum like she was mad at it. Her name tag read K. "Sorry to keep you guys waiting. The kitchen's a hot mess tonight." She snapped her gum and took an order pad from her apron. "The transatomizer is on the fritz, so if you came in hankering for a double-boiled char, you'll have to go to Izzy's. You're not here for the char, are you?" Leopold hesitated. "I don't even know what that is." She laughed out loud, snorting a little, then swatted his arm playfully. "You're hilarious." She smacked her gum again. "All right, what'll it be?" Emmett and Leopold looked at their unopened menus. The cover pictured a smiling man in a chef's hat holding a focuser in one hand and a wooden ladle in the other. "How long is this?" Emmett said, struggling to peel open the pages. They were stuck together with a smear of something that was either strawberry jam or blood. Leopold managed to pry his apart, and the book fell open with a heavy thud. 37 chapters, Kay said. "Of course, that's just our late-night menu. If you want the full Monty, come back for lunch." "So, what'll you have?" Leopold turned a page, then closed the book. His head was too full. He couldn't decide. Remembering Aunt's recommendation, he said, "How about a slice of pie?" She smiled. "What kind? We got 17. "Anything is fine." "Oh, that's my favorite," said Kay. Emmett frowned. "What's your favorite?" "Anything," she said, cocking her hip. "So, one for each of you, or are you going to share?" Emmett looked offended. "I don't share food." "2 slices, no problem. That all?" No," said Leopold hesitantly. "Could we get 2 cups of coffee?" "You got it. Back in a few." She flipped her notepad shut, and with another crack of her gum, and a friendly smile at Leopold, she sauntered off. Emmett was the first to speak. "Okay, that was weird. This whole place is weird." "No, I mean, why'd she keep smiling at you like that?" "I don't know." "Apparently you're hilarious," Emmett seemed to consider this. "Are you hilarious?" "I'd say my hit rate is like 40-90%. "That seems generous," Emmett said impassively. He returned his attention to the menu, opened to a page showing a jello mold in which something resembling eyeballs was suspended. Leopold exhaled sharply. "Hey." Emmett looked up. "Yeah?" "Why the hell aren't you freaking out?" Leopold looked around, then lowered his voice. "This is crazy." Emmett closed his menu. "No," he said calmly. "This is awesome. Sunday is real. You had the visions, then you got the key. The token. The token, whatever. The point is, this is fate. You're supposed to be here, Larry." "Yeah, but what if I'm not?" he said quietly. "What if this was all some big mistake?" Emmett hesitated. "What are you talking about?" From the moment they'd stepped onto Angel's flight, the idea that this had all been an accident had occurred a small but increasingly loud corner of Leopold's thoughts. There'd been no gloss, no fuss, no finesse to his arrival. Everything had been dark and grimy and difficult, like he'd been pushing through a barred door. It was hard to reconcile. His dreams were coming true, but they weren't happening the way he'd dreamed. There hadn't been a key but a token. There had been no magical door, just an unmanned, half-broken trolley car. There had been no welcome, no acknowledgement of his arrival. Instead, his every move had been trailed by literal garbage. Even now, he was skulking around in Sunder, hiding his identity for reasons that felt important but unclear. What if it turns out they don't actually want us here, said Leopold. What if this was all a screw-up at the head office or something? What if the raccoon got its depressed teenagers mixed up? No chance, Emmett was shaking his head. That raccoon did not get its teenagers mixed up. If anyone's supposed to be here, it's you. He pointed at Leopold. This depressed teenager. Sunder has always been your dream. Leopold forced a laugh. She's never even mentioned it, you know. Who? My mum. Leopold took a breath. The videotapes were hers, but she never gave them to me. I found them in her stuff after she died. He'd been over it 1,000,000 times in his head, searched his memory again and again. If his mum had so much as breathed a word to him about Sunder or about the tapes, it would have been seared into his mind. In his more desperate younger years, Leopold had convinced himself she'd left the tapes behind on purpose, that she'd wanted them to find them and to find Sunder, but eventually he'd resigned himself to the disappointing fact that he'd probably never know for sure. Now he was here, in Sunder, grasping for meaning again. Grasping for his mother. Look, said Emmett, the only thing we know for sure is that we're here. You're here. He shrugged. And yeah, maybe it's a little grittier than we imagined it would be, but it's real. You really wanted to know whether we're supposed to be here? He pointed out the window. Let's fuck around and find out. Leopold sank back into his pleather seat, suddenly short of breath. Heat was building behind his eyes. Years of agony were unknotting in his chest, a lifetime of self-doubt being undone in minutes. It was almost too much to bear. Hey, Emmett said quietly. You're not crazy, Larry. And you never were. Chapter 19. Kay slid 2 overfull cups of black coffee toward them, dumped a handful of creamers onto the table, then set 2 chipped plates down with a clatter. Emmett mopped up some spilled coffee as Leopold stared in awe at the large, golden-crusted wedges of pie. Oozing from the crust was a jammy indigo filling. Enjoy, she said before swishing off to another table. Once Kay was safely out of earshot, Emmett asked, What kind of pie do you think it is? Blueberry? Leopold guessed. An aged busboy paused beside their booth to readjust the tub of dishes he was carrying, then glowered into it. Something in the bottom was snarling. Oh, shut up in there, he growled, using his free hand to slap the dishes with a dirty rag. Emmett and Leopold looked at one another uncertainly, and then, more uncertainly, ate at the pie. We have to take at least a couple of bites, Leopold said. It'd be rude not to, Emmett agreed. Leopold leaned down and gave his slice a sniff. Seemed safe. He picked up his fork and cut a small bite. The texture was convincingly pie-like. Slowly he chewed, and then he nearly fell out of the booth. Oh my God! What? Emmett sounded alarmed. Is it disgusting? No, said Leopold, taking another bite. It's amazing. I hope you mean amazing. Leopold nodded eagerly, too distracted by the bright flavors going off like fireworks on his tongue. The first bite had started out tasting like perfectly ripe, sweet raspberries, but before he'd swallowed, had become the best apple pie he'd ever had. The second bite began as pumpkin, then transformed to cherry cola spiced with something incongruously savory but delicious, which left a pleasant fizzing sensation in his mouth. Emmett leaned in. What does it taste like? Lots of things. I can't describe it, Leopold said while cutting the third bite, but it might be the single best thing I've eaten in my entire life. Seriously? Emmett picked up his fork and took a huge bite, his eyes widening as he chewed. Holy shit, he said with his mouth full. Are we eating magic right now? Yeah. A thrill landed down Leopold's back. I'm pretty sure we are. As Emmett redoubled his efforts, something drew Leopold's attention to the corner of the diner. Alone in the dim booth sat a girl about his age. She wore a dark green cloak that matched the mossy green of her eyes, its hood pulling around her shoulders, her dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. She was beautiful. He couldn't help but register this as she stared at him, with a look bordering on suspicion, until he met her gaze straight on and she ducked behind one of the bright spots of voluminous menus. How long had she been watching? Were other people? Leopold worried that he and Emmett had been talking too loudly and did not sound at all like magically able tourists from Iowa. Larry! Emmett was snapping his fingers at Leopold. Where'd you go? Sorry. This girl was staring at me. Emmett looked skeptical. Where? Wait, don't look! Emmett turned and sat up in his seat, obvious as a fire alarm. The one in the booth by the bathrooms? Leopold scolded. Idiot, I told you not to look! Emmett dropped back down into his seat. Okay, is there something about this place that makes you irresistible to women? Leopold's face went hot. Shut up! The girl was still pretending to read her menu. Oh, shit, Emmett hissed. Is that really what time it is? He was gaping at a clock on the wall. It was well after midnight. I told my parents I'd be home by 11:30. He dug out his phone. I have to text them, at least let them know I'm... What the hell? He turned the screen toward Leopold. It was black, with a message in red across the middle. Slack tech disallowed. Leopold raised his eyebrows, took out his own phone, and tapped its screen. He got the same message. Slack was the pejorative Sundarian term for people with no magical ability, and though Leopold was increasingly sure he wasn't one, his phone apparently qualified as slack tech. All right, time to go, said Emmett, gathering his things. I mean, at this point, your dad's going to straight up kill you when you get home, right? You don't want to be late for your own murder? Leopold didn't laugh. A sudden apprehension had gripped him. Wait, we can't just leave. Why not? How will we get back again? Ark gave us 2 tokens for Angel's flight, remember? And I'm sure we could get more just by asking. He was super casual about it. Right, said Leopold said, relaxing. He fished the coins from the welcome bag and held them gingerly in his hand. After years of waiting for his key to Sunder, the idea that he could come and go as he pleased was so profound he felt light-hearted just thinking about it. Why Angel's flight had been retired and abandoned was a question for another time, but that was the point. They had time. Take both, Emmett said generously. There's no way I'm coming here without you anyway. Leopold took a bracing breath. Thanks, man, he said. I appreciate that. He dropped the coins back into the small bag and placed it on the table. He'd go home tonight to face his father, who'd rage at him for at least an hour, but the idea didn't fill him with the same dread it usually did. Just knowing this world would be waiting for him, and that the tokens were safely in his possession, was like wearing a suit of armor. One Richter could do nothing to pierce. Check, please! Emmett signaled to Kay while Leopold searched the welcome bag for their meal coupon. Along with a few brochures, a bright green card fluttered open. It was about the size of a dollar bill and printed on heavy paper. Leopold read it, reread it, and then slid the card across the table. Hey, look at this. Emmett snatched up the card. It's a gift certificate, he said, his eyes widening as he scanned the text. For spells. They looked at each other. Mr. Worthington, Leopold said evenly, I am of the opinion that it would be completely irresponsible of us to leave here tonight without first doing some magic. Emmett nodded seriously. Stupid, even. Kay arrived with the check. You guys have a coupon, is that right? Emmett handed it over and then held up the green certificate. You wouldn't happen to know where we could use this, would you? She squinted at it, then glanced out the darkened window. Tonight? Tonight, the boy said at the same time. Kay pursed her lips, thinking. At this hour, only one place will be open. Chapter 20. The blindingly bright sign on the roof read 99 spells, and more. The magic store stood between a hamburger joint and a print shop, both closed for the night. Despite the late hour, Sunder Hill's eternal dusk still cast a pinkish glow over everything, but the streets were increasingly deserted and a chill had sharpened the air. Leopold, arms folded tight across his chest as they crossed the small parking lot, wished he still had his jacket. It looked like the kind of chain drug emporium that anchored every strip mall in LA, its windows allowing a glimpse of neat aisles and carpeted floors within. The automatic doors whooshed open. They walked into a blast of garish white light and overzealous air conditioning. At the front, a young man in purple vest was passing a woman's purchase over a beacon scanner. A lone shopper meandered with a basket. Signs above each aisle announced categories like cleaning prod and household charms, cold remedies, glamours and bladder control. The in-store speakers were playing an old cheesy pop song, which was quickly interrupted by a PA announcement. George, customer assistance in Beauty and Life Extension. George, Beauty and Life Extension. The store was a mishmash of the magical and the mundane. There were shelves of items that didn't seem magical at all, mingled with things that clearly were. Leopold grabbed a plastic-handled basket from a stack by the door and joined Emmett, who was already browsing. Okay, this isn't magical, Emmett said, turning over a stick of deodorant in his hand. I use this brand, and here, he picked up a box of toothpaste. They carry this at CVS. Well, CVS sure as hell doesn't carry this. Leopold studied a small black bottle. Never stink. Says it makes you odorless forever. In fact, he squinted at the fine print, if you take enough, you even become over-absorbent. Whatever that means. Emmett crossed to the other side of the aisle. No way, he said, his voice hushed with wonder. Doppel buddies. What, seriously? Leopold turned to look. A stack of dusty boxes lined a shelf, each containing one naked, sexless, blank-faced action figure. The stock color was grey, but the label promised the figures would adapt to any skin tone. Grow a new you, read the display. Leopold grabbed a box, turning it reverently in his hands. Remember the episode where Max makes a copy of himself? Yeah, so it would impersonate him at school while he was battling Noxum in Sunder. Leopold dropped a buddy into the basket. But then it turns violent in episode 6 or 7 and he has to hunt it down and... Hold up, Emmett said. Why doesn't anything here have a price tag? Maybe everything's the same price? Leopold said doubtfully. He took the gift certificate from his pocket and studied the back. Wait, this says it's redeemable for only one item. It appeared at a line of smaller type, of low value. Emmett muttered. Art, you cheap bastard. Ah, shit, okay. If we only get one thing, what should it be? They looked at each other. A focuser, they said in unison. Chapter 21. Emmett flagged down the only clerk on shift, a grumpy, grey-bearded man who'd been stocking supplies in the divination aisle. The name tag in his red polo shirt said George, and when Leopold and Emmett explained what they wanted, George set down a price tagging gun, cut them off with a single, tired look, and slouched off towards the ether focuses. With unsubtle irritation, he unlocked the doors of a glass cabinet. All right, what'll it be? Arranged upon the cabinet's felt-lined shelves were all manner of focuses, which looked like gleaming camera lenses housed in sleek circular bodies. For a moment, they were all Leopold could see, as if a spotlight from heaven were illuminating the dingy cabinet, throwing all else into darkness. The ether focuses was Sunder's answer to the magic wand, its lens designed to strengthen and concentrate a spark's magical energy in a particular direction. Spells cast without them were messy, unpredictable, weak, unfocused, and, with rare exceptions, illegal. Leopold fought a powerful urge to grab one off the shelf without asking. We need your best model, Emmett said confidently, and Leopold nodded. George rolled his eyes. Good ones with Prima Glass are up top. Contact, Rolleiflex, Hasselblad. They auto-calibrate to your ability level. The lens open up to f1.2 for maximum spell extraction, and are built like Sherman tanks. You could drop one from an airplane and probably still get a decent cast out of it. Then, with a sidelong glance, you planning on dropping yours out of an airplane? No, Leopold laughed nervously. Then I'd recommend one of these. He pointed to a lower shelf, stocked with focuses that were more compact but sturdy looking. Emmett took out the gift certificate. Which one will this get us? Which one will this get us? Scanning it, George's irritation blossomed into unveiled anger. He studied Leopold and Emmett a beat, then stalked away, muttering, "Goddamn teenagers, always wasting my time." Wait, Emmett called after him. We're serious customers. Do you take regular Will credit cards? Quietly, Leopold said, You have a credit card? It's my mum's, Emmett answered under his breath. For emergencies. George's only response was to scowl and point at the massive sign by the entrance which read, Cash only. Undaunted, Leopold and Emmett rushed toward the register, where George was trying to slip out a door marked Employee Exit. Is there anywhere around here we can get Sunder money? Leopold called after him. An ATM or something? George finally turned around, incredulous. What the hell is Sunder money? Emmett and Leopold traded a glance. You know, I can't remember Max actually buying anything on the show, Leopold whispered. I just assumed... I've got cash, Emmett exclaimed triumphantly, pulling a few bills from his wallet. 10, no, 20. $20. You take American dollars? Are you kids stoned? The clerk said flatly. No, sir, Leopold said, straightening to his full height. George considered them for a moment, then took the money from Emmett's outstretched hand. All right, whatever, he said, nodding toward the cabinet. I might have something for you. Chapter 22. What he had for them was a piece of shit. The focuser in Leopold's hand was made of plastic, small enough to slip into his pocket, its fraying wrist strap printed with the cartoon images of cats and ice cream cones. Funcast was stamped on the back. George thrown in a couple of disposable precast spells, circular semi-opaque filters that fit over the tiny lens, which was so badly scratched it looked like someone had tried to sand wood with it. But it was a focuser, and it was theirs. They stood in the alley outside 99 Spells, Emmett tilting the precast up to a slant of streetlight so he could make out the writing around the edges. "We've got one called Little Levitator and one called Make It Snow," he said. "Seems pretty self-explanatory." He held them out to Leopold. "You pick." Leopold chose the Little Levitator, then slipped his wrist through the focuser's strap. Cigarette butts and discarded precasts were scattered nearby. Clearly, they weren't the first people to hang out here, casting cheap spells. Suddenly, his throat went dry. It was happening. He was about to do magic. Real magic. On purpose. This night had been so surreal that he'd hardly stopped to process it at all, to feel the weight of the moment. Years of dreaming, of doubting, had all come to this. "Don't be in your head right now," Emmett nodded at the focuser in Leopold's hand. "Nike." Leopold frowned. "What?" "Just do it, Larry." "Dumbass," Leopold said, cracking a grin, and Emmett smiled to match. There was no one at either end of the alley. No one watching. Leopold was hardly even aware of the cold. He fit the precast levitation spell over the focuser's lens and snapped it into place with a satisfying click. The fun cast's only movable parts were its flimsy aperture ring and a single cast button on the side. His finger hovered over the button. "Well, here goes nothing." He triggered the button and the lens flashed dimly. There was a robotic whisper at the edge of hearing. The auto incantation. And then he flung into the air and flipped upside down. Leopold cried out as his stomach did a somersault and his car keys dropped from his pocket. Emmett shouted an alarm and made a swipe for Leopold. But he was too late. Graffitied bricks blurred past as Leopold soared feet first toward the clouds, but his panic proved unnecessary. About 20 feet off the ground, he came to a sudden halt, still upside down. "You okay?" Emmett called out anxiously. "I'm okay," Leopold said, his heart racing. "I think I aimed too high." Blood rushing to his head, he took hold of the focuser again and this time pointed it at the ground. He pushed the button and flipped upright, the pavement and the pink sky trading places. His confidence slowly building, Leopold twisted the plastic aperture ring and descended a few feet. He twisted it the other way and rose again, bouncing to a stop a little higher than before. "I think you're getting it," Emmett shouted. Leopold aimed the focuser at a nearby wall, pushed the cast button, and was yanked sideways until his feet met brick. He stood then at a 90-degree angle to the wall, casting a huge shadow across the alley below. It was dizzying and surreal. With his head gently spinning, he took a few exploratory steps. His shoes stuck like they were glued in place until the moment he lifted them, when they came away with easy pops. From this vantage, he could see the rooftops of Sunder Hill. He lingered a moment, gazing out across Sunder's dazzling Main Street, where a few night owls were leaving a beautiful Art Deco theatre, the movie titles on its marquee sign spelled out in runic Sunderese. A few streets away, the top floor of a fortress-like Sunderbank and Trust was encircled with angry, swirling mist. Some sort of defense mechanism, Leopold reckoned, against the thieves or something worse. Standing proud at the edge of it all, the tallest building in Sunder Hill was a towering pyramid of glass. Leopold recognized this as the headquarters of the department, where Sunder's governing bureaucrats and decision-makers had their offices. Reflecting the sky, its mirrored surfaces were a beacon of gold and pink that stood in stark contrast to the dim and magical neighborhoods that rolled out endlessly beyond it. It was all here, all knowable, all finally within Leopold's grasp. There was a jangle below as Emmett scooped up Leopold's fallen keys. "You good?" he called up to Leopold. "Yeah," Leopold could feel something strange coursing through him. A stinging behind his eyes, a fullness in his chest. It was, he realized, happiness. Chapter 23. "I still don't understand why it didn't work for you," said Leopold. They were walking back toward Angel's Flight, passing the bright spot, its windows now dark. "It was probably that crappy focuser, or maybe the snow precast was expired." "Seriously, it's not a big deal," Emmett replied, his eyes on a service station at the corner, where a lone man stood gassing an old boat-like sedan. There was a wistful quality to his voice when he spoke. "I don't really care that much whether or not I can do magic." 3 times Emmett had tried and failed to get the Funcast to work, but to no avail. Finally, he'd insisted that getting home before dawn was more important, and Leopold had begrudgingly relented. Still, he couldn't deny the glaring differences between their experiences. In Emmett's hand, the focuser had seemed clumsy, alien, but to Leopold, casting had felt natural, like something he'd done 1,000 times before, the hum of power in his hands as he held the focuser, a sensation embedded in cell memory. Somewhere in his marrow, the feeling fit, and he allowed himself, for the space of a breath, to picture more. Him, Leopold Berry, among the most powerful sparks in Sunder, entrusted with protecting the magical world from shambling, snarling night realm beasts. Learning colossal spells, wielding some fat lens focuser to blast and Noxum with a bolt of death magic, then dragging its body into a black, bubbling containment pit. The fantasy was so grand, he was almost embarrassed for himself. Leopold cleared his throat, cleared his mind, then returned his eyes to Emmett. You sure you don't want to try again before we leave? I'm sure, Emmett said, shifting his gaze skyward. Sunder was always your dream, man, not mine. I was happy to be along for the ride then, and I'm happy to be along for the ride now. Leopold nodded, ever grateful for his friend's even temper. They walked for a while in affable quiet, taking in the final blocks of Sunder Hill's dreamy, pink-hued cityscape before the Angel's Flight station. They passed a travel agency, its window advertising trips to Sunders around the country. There was a flash sale on Tumbleport tours to Muncie. And then a grand hotel, this one firmly secured to the ground, with a tuxedo valet standing outside a lobby gleaming with chandeliers. Nearby, a garbage man was tossing trash bags into a portable hole he dragged along behind him. The clatter the bags made when they fully hit the bottom several seconds later was an almost inaudible tink. You know what's weird? Said Emmett, his eyes shifting to Leopold. In the show, there are outer-realm creatures walking around in Sunder. Orags, parishes, the occasional well-behaved rust fiend. But can you remember seeing any tonight? Leopold paused, trying to recall, then shrugged. In the show, Max rode a flying horse, he pointed out. I don't think whoever made Sunderworld was super concerned with accuracy. It occurred to him that the show might have fudged or exaggerated some details to make Sunder appear less real. The more artificial the fantasy seemed, the less likely some overly curious slack would go looking for an entrance. The same story might also explain the show's bargain basement production values. Leopold was about to suggest this to Emmett when he realized Emmett was no longer beside him, but had darted off to examine a nearby statue. Check this out, he said, beckoning to Leopold as he bent to study the plaque at its base. Emmett could never resist a good informational plaque. Says this guy founded Sunder, Charles Vigdor. Leopold joined him at the foot of the statue. Sunder had a founder? He gazed up at a stocky man cast in 20 feet of bronze, clad in bronze cowboy boots, a bronze 10-gallon hat, and a giant bronze mustache that covered half his face. They say he drilled the world's first ether well right here in Sunder Hill in 1909. Emmett began to read aloud. Striking what's known as the vein, Mr. Vigdor tapped into a seemingly limitless deposit of ether that attracted sparks from around the world to Los Angeles. Thanks to this discovery, magical technology has progressed more in the past 100 years than in the previous 1,000. The pink clouds flickered without warning, popping on and off like a faulty bulb. What the hell? Emmett said, looking up from the words he could no longer read. The sky went completely dark. Down the street, someone shouted, "Oh, come on!" Ether outage? Leopold guessed, remembering the angry guy from the Tumbleport station. Whatever it is, it can't be good, Emmett said. Just then, they heard the distant, eerie wail of an emergency siren. Chapter 24. Siren pitched slowly up and down. Pale moonlight shone across rooftops all along the block, but otherwise everything was enveloped in shadow and gloom. Even the street lamps and lighted shop windows had gone dark. And then the voice rang out from every direction, issuing as if from loudspeakers. It was the same male announcer they'd heard several times before. This is the emergency warning system. Please proceed to the nearest refuge point to await further instructions. Refuge point? Emmett repeated, sounding a little worried now. He pulled out his phone to use as a light, only to be reminded it didn't work. Yeah, it's definitely time to go home. Leopold stayed rooted to the spot. His pulse was racing. There was an unease in the air, the promise of danger, and yet Leopold felt no compulsion to flee. In fact, he was experiencing an overwhelming surge of protectiveness for this absurd, magical place. Something was wrong, and he wanted to know what it was. More than that, he realized. He wanted to help. Life had changed irrevocably for him tonight. Hell, he'd done magic tonight. Leopold knew he couldn't stay here forever. He knew he'd have to go home and deal with his normal life eventually, but he wanted to make sure that Sunder was still here when he came back. Because he was definitely coming back. Larry? Proceed directly to the nearest refuge point, the announcement repeated, and comply with all instructions given by paladins or peace officers. At the word paladins, Leopold straightened. Damn, Emmett said with a sigh. Did he just say paladins? Leopold was fighting a smile. Yeah, we have to stay now, don't we? I think we do, Mr. Worthington. After Richter kills you, my parents are going to kill me. Double homicide. Worth it though, right? Hell yeah, Emmett said, almost laughing. Then he turned and shouted into the empty air. Does anyone know the way to the refuge point? This way. The voice had come from the sidewalk across the street, where a group of people were moving through a shaft of moonlight. They all appeared to be heading in the same direction, though they didn't seem to be in much of a hurry. Leopold and Emmett jogged over to them. Emmett asked what was going on. Knoxum alarm, said an older man in a coat too heavy for the weather. Nothing to worry about. Probably just a drill. Knoxum were the most feared monsters in Sunder. While they ranged widely in size and lethality, minor Knoxum could usually be dispatched without calling them in the paladins. Major Knoxum were terrifying creatures of another order altogether, and in the show were known for murderous rampages that claimed dozens of lives before they could be put down. Does this happen a lot? Asked Leopold, a thrill going down his spine. Once or twice a month, said someone whose voice they recognized. It was George from 99 Spells. He turned on a flashlight and the beam bobbled ahead of them. First time they've cut the ether, though, said a yawning lady. She sounded more tired than worried. I was just about to cast myself to sleep. In fact, none of them seemed worried. They had this slouching pace of high school kids during the routine fire drill. Larry. Emmett's elbow dug into his rib. Look. Out of the shadows came a small troop of uniformed young men and women. They strode down the middle of the street, shoulder to shoulder in tailored green paladin uniforms and tall brown boots. Bandoliers studded with vials of ether across their chests, and they carried serious-looking focuses, the lenses thick glass glinting in the moonlight. Thank you for your service, George called out. Leopold and Emmett had once made paladin uniforms for themselves, repurposed from old Boy Scout stuff, costumes for the homespun version of Sunderworld. Most young Sparks were required to serve for a time in the Paladin Corps, widely respected as Sunder's first and best line of defense against the Noxum. Max's mentor had been a Paladin commander, battle-scarred from the last Noxum War. They hadn't yet reached the refuge point when the siren began to wind down. A new announcement echoed and their group came to a sudden halt. This has been a test of the emergency warning system. You may return to your homes. Thank you for your cooperation. There were murmurs of irritation, several people muttering choice words for the inconveniences they had endured. Do you think the lights will come back on? Leopold whispered to Emmett. Before Emmett could respond, a pyramid of boxy televisions blared to life in the window of a nearby electronics shop, the jarring light and loud sounds crackling the silence. A dozen flickering screens showed the same footage. A woman with cropped white hair and black-rimmed glasses fielding questions from a podium. A chyron across the bottom read, Executive Angela Ramirez's news conference earlier today. Her voice boomed. Leopold winced even as he pushed closer to the screen. I want to assure you, the woman was saying, that we're making every effort to ensure the ether supply remains uninterrupted. I know these outages have been inconvenient for everyone, but the situation is temporary. They're showing this again, George complained. The woman in the bathrobe shushed him. Executive was an honorific reserved for the elected leader of Sunder, the head of its small but powerful governing body. In Sunderworld, the executive had been betrayed by an older male actor who'd given the character a sarcastic edge and a quick temper. As he watched the genuine articles speak, Leopold had a dreamlike moment. He was both exhausted and exhilarated, his mind running on fumes and adrenaline. The garish blue glare of the TVs contrasted against the dark around him, making the cold night feel milky and soft. After so many years of telling himself that Sunder was fake, now he had to keep reminding himself that it was real, that right now, he was standing in the middle of a Sunder street, watching the Sunder executive field questions. It was not only real, but surreal. Bro, Emmett said quietly. Leopold smiled. I know. Off-screen, a reporter asked, Executive, is there any connection between the ether shortages and the recent uptick in Noxum attacks? None at all, she said firmly. The shortages are due to unusually extreme seasonal fluctuations in our ether wells and should resolve themselves before long. The attacks were isolated incidents and nothing our brave paladins couldn't handle. Even so, I would like to remind everyone to take basic anti-Noxum precautions and to conserve ether whenever possible. Another reporter. And what about the search for the channeler? Couldn't that offer relief on both fronts? Leopold felt a sudden shock at the word channeler, a wire pulling taut within him. Channeler. Noun, the most powerful magical being on the planet. More specifically, an extremely rare spark that came along only once a generation or so, who could kill Noxum with little effort and summon a vast amounts of ether from the air, enabling them to cast substantial spells without a focuser. On the show, Max had discovered that he was a channeler and spent much of the first season honing his untapped abilities. Are you hearing this? Emmett hissed. Leopold nodded numbly. Emmett hit him in the arm. That's gotta be you. Leopold tensed, apprehension radiating through him. He turned sharply to Emmett. Don't even joke about that. I'm not. Will you two hush? Said the boss-robed lady. Several reporters were asking about the channeler search now, all talking over one another, and Executive Ramirez had to raise her hand for a quiet. She dusted her glasses and continued. The search is ongoing, she said with a brittle smile. That's all I have time for today, thank you. With a respectful nod, she turned and walked away while the camera held on the empty podium. The sky became alight with pink clouds again, though dimmer than before, and the street lights with it, jolts of static crackling the air as they snapped on. The process was staggered so that the lamps and neon signs at the end of the block lit up first, and then rolled towards them until they were awash in color. A billboard advertising the services of a magical injury lawyer flickered on across the street, and the group of irritable stragglers slowly dispersed, leaving Emmett and Leopold alone. The pair stood frozen, still watching the blaring televisions as if hypnotized. That was Executive Angela Ramirez earlier today. On the dozen screens, the camera had cut to a pair of news anchors inside a studio. As always, if you think you know someone who might be a channeler, contact the department right away. A phone number flashed across the screen. They both stared at it. Larry, Emmett whispered. Leopold couldn't move. Mr. Berry, Emmett turned to face him. We need to find a phone. No, Leopold said sharply. There was a sudden electrical pop from the street behind them. Emmett turned to look. When he turned back, he grasped Leopold by the shoulders and spun him around. Across the street, lit from inside and shining brightly, was a phone booth. Chapter 25. Leopold and Emmett crammed into the small booth, Leopold wrestling the rusted accordion door shut behind him. Ivy had snaked its way inside the poorly sealed space, the interior half devoured by vines that Emmett forcibly tore away from the heavy black receiver. Finally, he lifted the phone from its cradle, pressing it into Leopold's hands as if it were his firstborn child. Call. This is crazy! Leopold gazed at the scuffed phone, shaking his head. The dial tone buzzed insistently. I can't be the channeler. Why the hell not? Are you kidding? Maybe because I only ever cast one spell, like 20 minutes ago. So what? Emmett countered. Did Max start off casting tons of spells right away? That doesn't mean anything. If I'm the channeler, why was it so hard to get here? And why did it take so long to get my token? And who knows? You probably weren't ready yet. Emmett tried to gesture out the window, and in the process nearly slapped Leopold in the face. Isn't it obvious? Leopold flinched. Isn't what obvious? All of it. The tapes, the show, the last 6 years of your life. There's a reason you were obsessed with Sunderworld. There's a reason you kept seeing into Sunder. It wasn't random, and it wasn't just because your mum died. You found those tapes because you were supposed to. Emmett pointed towards the pyramid of TVs across the street, and this time he really did hit Leopold in the face. Ow! Muttered Leopold. What the hell? Pay attention, they're running out of ether. The Noxum situation is worse than they want to admit. They're overdue for a channeler. Emmett looked at him seriously. What are the odds that everything you've been through all these years was some big coincidence? Leopold tensed. He'd always felt deep down that there had been more at work behind the scenes of his life than chance and randomness. That there had to be some meaning, some purpose in all he'd experienced. Emmett was only saying something he'd thought himself 1,000 times. Leopold was too practical to lie, and the truth was he didn't want to. He remembered casting the spell in the alley, how natural the focuser had felt in his hands, how quickly and easily he'd mastered the basic technique. Larry, Emmett tried again. These people need you. Leopold's arms prickled with goosebumps. With one last look at the TV screens across the street, he raised the phone to his ears and began to dial.